إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellencies, colleagues, I think we can start. As I see some settling down, let's start as on time as we can possibly make it. Excellencies, distinguished representative, colleagues, I hereby declare open the 29th meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. In accordance with established practice, I would like to announce that the Council has, in closed meetings, examined the situation of human rights in Tajikistan under the complaint procedure established pursuant to Council Resolutions 5/1 and decided to discontinue the consideration of the situation. This is in Tajikistan, on Tajikistan. The Council also took note of the measures and commitments presented by the government of Tajikistan through the note verbal number C34/26/190 dated 25 June 2026 and requested the government of Tajikistan to share with the member states of the Council through the Secretariat by the Council's 63rd session updated information on their implementation. In conformity with the confidentiality of the procedure, members of the Council should make no reference in the public debate to the confidential decision and material concerning the country. Now, turning to the urgent debate, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, we will now start our urgent debate. As per usual practice, let me begin and recall a few practical details for the record. On 29 June 2026, I received a letter from the permanent representative of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. Also on behalf of Germany, Ireland, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Norway, requesting the holding of an urgent debate during the ongoing 62nd session of the Human Rights Council to address the human rights situation in and around El Obeid, North Kordofan, in the context of the ongoing conflict in the Sudan. As decided by the Council during its 24th meeting on Tuesday, 30th of June, we shall now proceed with this urgent debate. The urgent debate will follow the same format as a general debate and will follow the time-saving measures adopted by the Council on June 30th, 2026. Speaking time will therefore be limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for all, with 5 minutes for the concerned country. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for his statement. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the signs from El Obeid are clear and unmistakable. Another human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan, this time in the capital of the strategic state of North Kordofan. Civilians have been subjected to siege-like conditions for 18 months, battered by relentless drone strikes as the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces battle for control over areas surrounding the city. My office documented 15 drone strikes on El Obeid and surrounding areas between 6 and 28 June, which killed at least 45 civilians and injured 41. The actual number of civilian casualties is likely higher. Across the Kordofan region, drones launched by both sides have repeatedly struck markets, schools, fuel stations, water infrastructure, and civilian vehicles. In recent weeks, we documented damage to at least 13 fuel stations in El Obeid and Al-Rahad from RSF drones. These attacks and fuel shortages have a compound impact, making it difficult for civilians to access clean water, food, transport, and healthcare, and to communicate with each other and the outside world. Shortages of clean water are reaching a critical point in Al Obeid. As the rainy season starts, this puts people at risk of waterborne diseases, including cholera. An influx of tens of thousands of people fleeing violence in other parts of Kordofan is straining resources even further. Some people are selling their belongings to finance their escape from the city. For many, the exorbitant cost of transport and constant attacks on vehicles along exit roads make leaving impossible. We have documented patterns of summary executions, abductions, torture and ill treatment, sexual violence and looting along the routes taken by displaced people across the Kordofan region. Those who stay in El Obeid are also at risk of arbitrary arrest and detention. People who have fled areas controlled by the RSF and allied forces are frequently accused of collaboration. And all this takes place against a backdrop of rising hate speech. Mr. President, the international community cannot allow a repeat of the widespread atrocities that took place in Samsam camp for displaced people and in Al-Fashar in North Darfur last year. My office assessed that at least 6,000 people were killed in the span of just 3 days when the RSF captured Al-Fashar. We found the RSF and allied militia committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, including mass killings, summary executions, sexual violence, and torture. These crimes were foreseen with repeated warnings by myself and my office, but they were not prevented. This is not a drill. It is a red alert that needs to land on the desks of heads of state and government around the world. Their phones should be running hot in the coming days and weeks with ideas on how to prevent atrocity crimes in El Obeid and in other places in Kordofan, where the same strategies are being deployed. Reports by my office and others, and this urgent debate, call for strong action at the highest level. The UN Security Council needs to fulfill its responsibilities to prevent atrocity crimes. El Obeid is a classic case that shows why the use of the veto should be limited, as proposed by France and Mexico more than 10 years ago. All leaders must use their influence to exert pressure on all parties, and particularly the RSF, to stop an offensive on El Obeid, to end strikes on civilians and essential infrastructure, to stop the flow of weapons, and to comply with their obligations under international law. There also needs to be accountability for the crimes that have been committed. I welcome the continued engagement of the International Criminal Court on Sudan as a path to that end, in addition to efforts based on universal jurisdiction. The safe and voluntary movement of civilians out of El Obeid must be guaranteed. We urgently need a humanitarian pause to allow for the unhindered delivery of food and humanitarian aid into the city and its surroundings. Mr. President, we also need to pay far closer attention to the political economy of this war. The leaders of the warring parties bear the greatest responsibility for 3 years of appalling suffering, but behind them, domestic and foreign players are benefiting from the carnage. Our upcoming report will focus on how conflict resources, specifically the trade in gum arabic, are fueling the war economy in Sudan. Other key commodities include gold and livestock. My office records and publishes information on business interests in other situations around the world. We are ready to do the same on Sudan. We also need to end the steady supply of weapons from outside the country to all sides, which continues with complete disregard for their use in contravention of international law. Without action to end this, the conflict risks continuing indefinitely. I repeat my call for the arms embargo on Darfur to be extended to the whole country. And I urge concerted efforts by the international community to assume its responsibilities to protect the people of Sudan and support their efforts to build a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic future. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. George Katrougalos, the Chair of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures, for his statement by video.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the honor of addressing the Council today on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. We welcome the convening of this special session at a moment of profound urgency for the people of Sudan. More than 3 years since the outbreak of hostilities between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, the conflict continues to exact an intolerable human cost. Throughout this period, the special procedures have closely monitored developments in the country, repeatedly warning of escalating violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law and their devastating consequences for civilians. Today, we are particularly alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in El Obeid, North Kordofan. Reports of a significant military build-up Intensified artillery shelling and drone strikes, together with the prolonged siege-like conditions endured by the city's population, point to an imminent risk of another catastrophic assault on civilians. As the High Commissioner recently warned, we have seen this pattern before. The attacks on Al-Fasher city and the Zamzama IDP camp demonstrated the devastating human rights consequences that follow when military operations are conducted in disregard of the fundamental principles of international law. The United Nations Security Council also warned of the imminent risk of mass atrocities. The international community cannot claim to be unaware of the risks facing the civilian population of El Obeid. The warning signs are unmistakable and they demand urgent preventive action. More than 3 years on, the conflict in the Sudan continues, as the international community has so far been unable to bring it to an end. This persistent failure, together with the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe, reinforces the broader crisis of multilateralism and calls into question the credibility of the collective security architecture established under the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, the situation in El Obeid must be understood within the broader context of a conflict that has become characterized by widespread and recurrent attacks against civilians. Indiscriminate violence, forced displacement, arbitrary detention and forced disappearances, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and grave restrictions on humanitarian access. The increasing use of explosive weapons, including drones, in populated areas has compounded the suffering of civilians, damaging essential infrastructure and further limiting access to food, water, healthcare, and other indispensable services. Siege tactics and repeated attacks on civilian infrastructure have left entire communities trapped in increasingly desperate conditions. Women and girls continue to bear a disproportionate burden of this conflict. The recent report issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documents deeply disturbing patterns of conflict-related sexual violence over the past 3 years, including rape, gang rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, and other forms of sexual violence perpetrated as tactics of war and terror. The report concludes that these violations have been committed on a widespread scale, frequently targeting civilians on the basis of their perceived ethnicity or affiliation, and have left profound and lasting physical, psychological, and social consequences for victims, their families, and their communities. Children continue to be exposed to unimaginable violence, deprivation and displacement. Older persons with disabilities, and other individuals in situations of heightened vulnerability face additional barriers to accessing safety, humanitarian assistance, and essential services. Journalists, medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and human rights defenders continue to operate under extreme risks while documenting violations and providing life-saving assistance. Mr. President, one of the most troubling features of this conflict is not only the scale of the violations, but also their repetition. The patterns documented over the past 3 years demonstrate that many of these abuses are no longer isolated incidents. They have become recurrent features of the conduct of hostilities. This repetition underscores the devastating consequences of persistent impunity. Special procedures reiterate that all parties to the conflict must fully comply with their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Civilians must never be the object of attack. Hospitals, schools, humanitarian facilities, and other civilian infrastructure must be protected. Humanitarian actors must be granted rapid, safe and unimpeded access to all populations as needed. Civilians wishing to leave areas affected by hostilities must be able to do so safely and voluntarily. We further recall that serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law may constitute war crimes and, when applicable, crimes against humanity. Those responsible, including those exercising and have responsibilities of command, must be held accountable through prompt, independent, impartial and effective investigations consistent with international standards. Accountability is not only essential to provide justice to victims, it is indispensable to preventing further violations and to laying the foundations for a sustainable peace. Peace cannot endure when grave violations remain unaddressed and victims are denied truth, justice and reparations. Mr. President, the Human Rights Council, Member States and all those with influence over the parties must act with urgency to help prevent another human rights catastrophe. Diplomatic efforts should prioritize the protection of civilians and the prevention of further atrocities, including conflict-related sexual violence, while supporting immediate humanitarian access and the safe movement of civilians. We also call upon neighboring states and the wider international community to continue to provide protection and assistance to those fleeing the conflict, to maintain access to asylum, and to support humanitarian operations responding to one of the world's gravest displacement and protection crises. Finally, special procedures reaffirm their readiness to continue support to the Council through independent monitoring, reporting and expert advice. We remain committed to working with the High Commissioner, the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan, and all relevant stakeholders to promote accountability, protect human rights, and support the aspirations of the Sudanese people for peace, justice, and dignity. I thank you.
Thank you. That was a 9-minute long statement. I think we should, in times of time-saving measures, we should take this into account. I now give the floor to Ms. Mona Rishwami, member of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Sudan. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Deputy High Commissioner, it is sad to meet again to discuss the situation in another city in Sudan. Yet it is the task of this Council, as its founding resolution reminds us, to prevent atrocities and to respond to human rights emergencies. The UN Fact-Finding Mission on Sudan remains committed to assisting the Council in this important responsibility. Today, Obeid and more than 500,000 residents, together with over 100,000 internally displaced persons, many of whom fled Al-Fashir and other devastated Sudanese cities, are calling on this Council to act. Despite communication difficulties, we have spoken with residents of the city. Fear is pervasive. Fear for their own fate and for the fate of their city. That fear has been amplified by statements and videos circulated on social media accounts affiliated with the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, showing military built-up around Obeid and preparations to enter the city. Obeid is a central civilian, administrative, and humanitarian hub linking central Sudan, Darfur, and South Kordofan. RSF now has control over all routes surrounding it, except towards the east. Residents described growing military movements around the city by the RSF and increasing insecurity with drone attacks along exit routes. Drone attacks by RSF are increasing in and around Al Obeid, together with targeting power stations, fuel depots, water facilities, transport routes, and military positions. Hospitals, markets, schools, and residential areas have been reportedly struck, causing civilian casualties and disrupting essential services. Women and children are among those killed and injured. Food, fuel, and transportation costs have risen dramatically. Water shortages are severe. Electricity is limited, and access to health care is deteriorating. Many households now depend on rainwater collection and communal kitchens. The danger facing Al Obeid lies not only in the threat of direct attacks, but in its progressive siege and the erosion of humanitarian lifelines. We have seen this modus operandi by the RSF before. In Al-Fashir and elsewhere, growing encirclement was followed by restrictions on movements, disruption of aid and food supplies, damage to critical infrastructure, aerial and artillery bombardment, and ultimately indiscriminate attacks against civilians. The presence of the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, associated military assets, and affiliated forces within civilian areas is compounding fear among the population. All parties must take feasible precautions to protect civilians. SAF and its allies are also increasingly resorting to arbitrary arrest, prolonged detention, and intimidation of individuals suspected of supporting the RSF, including those criticizing the war, advocating for peace, or expressing views on social media. Mr. President, we call on all parties to comply fully with international law, cease hostilities, and protect civilians and civilian objects. The RSF must stop attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including fuel depot, water facilities, transport routes, hospitals, markets, schools, and residential areas. SAF and its allies must avoid locating military personnel and objects within or near civilian areas and stop intimidating civilians. States with influence, particularly those providing drones, military assistance, or other form of support, must use their influence to protect civilians, prevent further escalation, and advance peace efforts. This is not only a humanitarian imperative, it is essential to regional and international peace and security. The people of Al Obeid are counting on you. We must not fail them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now we turn to states, statement by states. And let me just make 2 points. First is that the states that take the floor would be divided along member states and observer states. So we start with member states and then go to observer states. And secondly, before I turn to the country concerned and member states and observer states, please allow me to remind and call on all colleagues to adhere to the language that is commensurate with the dignity inherent to the discussion on human rights issues. I kindly request all speakers to uphold UN standards and use official terminology when referring to countries. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, we will now hear from the country concerned, and I give the floor to Mr. Mohildin Salim Ahmed Ibrahim, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Sudan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
In the name of God, Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished members of the Council, may the peace of God be upon you. On behalf of Sudan government and people, I would like to express to you our appreciation for all the efforts made by this Council and all UN organs as well as international partners in order to send the right message to the terrorist militia that, since it failed to seize power with weapons, has started an open war against the state, the people, the infrastructure and strategic civilian infrastructure. Your distinguished council knows very well that decisions and statements do not mean anything to a criminal militia that boasts about its disregard and disrespect to decisions. What happened in El Fasher is proof of that. The 5 states that have requested the convening of this debate should have taken the shortest way by sending an urgent and strong message to the state that sponsors the terrorist militia and some of the neighbors of Sudan to stop providing advanced military equipment and strategic drones that are now being used to against the city of Obeid and other cities, and to rapidly classify this terrorist group as a terrorist group, since it fulfills all the criteria according to the definition of terror and terrorist acts. Mr. President, my country is open to positively interact with genuine initiatives that aim at stopping this war by proxy, as the High Commissioner called it in this Council, as long as these initiatives are in accordance with the roadmap that was deposited by the President of the Transitional Sovereign Council at the UN on the 10th of March 2025, and as supported by the initiative for the government to achieve peace and deposited by the Prime Minister at the Security Council on the 22nd of December 2025. It's based on dismantling the militia and to gather its weapons and collect them in an area to be decided upon, and then to start security arrangements for a ceasefire in accordance with the Sudanese-owned political process with the support of the international community. The Sudanese government cooperates with the UN as well as the Country Office for Human Rights that was sent to the country upon our request, as well as the designated expert. Protecting human rights is for us a first priority. We are not only responding to external requests. The state and its mechanisms is working to achieve justice and provide remedy to victims and to prevent impunity. On the humanitarian level, we express our gratitude to states that have hosted refugees, and we also refer to the efforts made by the government in spite of the limited resources in order to provide an environment conducive to voluntary return. There are 4.3 million refugees and IDPs in accordance with the reports of IMO. The state is steadfast in providing all that is possible to facilitate and accelerate humanitarian assistance. I thank you. For information, I am from Obeid, this wounded city. It will never fall as long as we are alive. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now begin the list of members of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of a group of countries.
I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU. Albania, Liechtenstein, North Macedonia, Moldova and Montenegro align themselves with this statement. We meet at a moment for prevention. The patterns of atrocity documented by the fact-finding mission in its report Hallmarks of Genocide in Al-Fashir must not be repeated in El Obeid. The EU urges the RSF to halt their assault on El Obeid immediately and all parties to cease hostilities and to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. The primary responsibility for this war and for ending it lies with the leadership of both the SAF and the RSF and their affiliated militias, and with those who arm, finance and enable them. All external actors supplying weapons or other support must cease immediately, in line with the Berlin Principles for Sudan. Together with our quintet partners, the EU is working to advance an immediate ceasefire. At the Sudan conference in Berlin, the EU and its member states pledged over 800 million euros. Through the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, we are pursuing concrete work on the protection of critical infrastructure. We have reached agreement to expand our sanctions to those who profit from this war. We will continue to support the FFM and the ICC because we must end impunity. States with influence have the duty to exercise it now. The full statement can be found online. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative for Finland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, the Nordic Baltic countries are deeply concerned by the risk of large-scale atrocities in El Obeid. Intensified RSF drone attacks and SAF counter-operations are killing civilians and putting up to 500,000 people at risk in and around El Obeid. RSF encirclement is restricting movement and disrupting essential services, humanitarian operations and life-saving assistance. Safe, rapid and unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured. Civilians must be allowed to leave areas of danger voluntarily and without obstruction. Previous patterns of conduct by RSF, as reported by the UN, give serious cause for concern, including ethnically targeted violence, executions and other atrocities against civilians, including children, with rape being used as a method of warfare. The leadership of the SAF and the leadership of RSF, their affiliated militias and external actors supplying them with arms, bear the responsibility of this war. This war must end. External support that intensifies and prolongs the conflict must stop, and all actors with influence must act to prevent further atrocities. The only viable path forward is a durable ceasefire and an inclusive Sudanese-led and owned political process. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland on behalf of a group of countries.
President, thank you. President, this statement is made on behalf of the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice for Sudan. The conflict in Sudan continues to devastate the country, resulting in widespread civilian harm, mass displacement and constraints on humanitarian access and press freedom. In El Obeid, intensifying drone strikes have killed civilians and damaged critical infrastructure, driving acute shortages. With the start of the rainy season, needs are increasing, while humanitarian personnel face unacceptable attacks. The risk of large-scale atrocities is rising, with 500,000 civilians in grave danger. President, we must act with urgency to address the escalating risk of serious human rights violations and abuses in and around El Obeid. Today's debate and accompanying resolution send the strongest possible signal that the world is watching. We reiterate our support to the vital work of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for Sudan. We urge the Rapid Support Forces to end the siege-like conditions in El Obeid. All parties to the conflict should immediately de-escalate, facilitate safe passage for civilians and guarantee rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. We call on all states to refrain from harmful external interference, use their influence to call for the protection of civilians, humanitarian personnel, and the prevention of further atrocities, and to support a Sudanese-led path to peace. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya on behalf of the African Group.
Thank you, Mr. President. The African Group has been closely monitoring the ongoing development in Sudan, including Obeid, North Kordofan in the Republic of Sudan. We express our strong and unwavering solidarity with the civilian in Obeid and the people of Sudan at this difficult time. We are of the view that immediate and utmost priority is to silence the guns and achieve ceasefire, paving the way to humanitarian relief and peace negotiation and political dialogue. We strongly condemn any external interference in Sudan, which is fueling the Sudanese conflict in flagrant violation of all relevant African Union PSCs, communiques, and UNSC resolution. The group emphasizes its continued commitment to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and political unity of Sudan. We recall the importance of the principles of complementarity and the African solution to African problems. The group welcomes the regional mediation efforts and initiative to solve the crisis in Sudan. We also welcome all supporting efforts to the negotiation by the regional international actors. We reaffirm the need for a single coordinated international effort to resolve the crisis in Sudan under the auspices of the AU together with IGAD, with the support of the UN, League of Arab Emirates, and key international partners, and based on the AU roadmap for the resolution of Sudan crisis. In this regard, the group refers to the welcoming of the AU and the IGAD to the peace initiative presented by the government of Sudan at the United Nations Security Council on December 22, 2025. We urge parties to implement the Jeddah Agreement to ensure protection of civilian and humanitarian aid delivery in Sudan. We urge international community to provide all necessary support to Sudan. The group appreciates the cooperation of government of Sudan with the OHCHR and the UN designated experts and urge it to continue that cooperation. We urge OHCHR to continue its technical assistance to Sudan. We believe that states have the primary responsibility for the promotion and protection of human rights. The consent of the concerned country remains a crucial element for the process of the implementation of the mandates of any mechanism established by HRC or expansion of the mandate of the existing mechanism. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تعرف دولة الكويت عن بعد.
Thank you, President. Kuwait is extremely troubled by developments in Obeid, in and around Obeid, in this friendly country, Sudan. Kuwait condemns the atrocities committed by the RSF and affecting innocents. We condemn against civilians, against civilian infrastructure, similarly the obstacles to receiving key services. For us, the best way to address this situation is through a ceasefire and through dialogue. There needs to be an inclusive political process owned by the Sudanese, preserving the sovereignty, unity of Sudan and its independence. We support efforts to reach a peaceful solution, comprehensive solution to this crisis, to meet the aspirations of the Sudanese people for peace. We believe the international community should see the suffering of the Sudanese people and should support efforts towards reaching a ceasefire and to reach peace and stability in the kindred country of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Mr. Chair, my country expresses its deep concern regarding the continuous suffering of the Sudanese people, escalation and recurrent attacks by the RSF on civilian infrastructure in and around Obeid. We call upon all parties to respect the international humanitarian law, international law for human rights, to diffuse tension, self-restraint, and prevent fighting that will lead to catastrophic consequences on civilians. We reiterate the need to engage in a dialogue between all Sudanese Sudanese parties to a lasting end of the conflict, to address humanitarian situation, and to launch large-scale negotiations that will ultimately lead to a comprehensive and lasting peace. We reiterate our steadfast support to the unity, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Sudan, and our rejection of all forms of interference in internal affairs, as well as full respect of the option of this brotherly people's choice choice of this brotherly people to achieve freedom, peace, justice, and prosperity. We reiterate the importance on building on human rights mechanisms that enjoy approval and trust of the concerned country and that can interact in the field and access the field. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Bulgaria is deeply concerned by the significant escalation of the conflict in Sudan's North Kordofan state. We are alarmed by the drastically deteriorating human rights situation resulting from siege-like conditions that have persisted for 18 months. This has had a significant adverse impact on the civilian population. Obeid must not become another El Fasher. Prevention, protection of civilians, and unhindered humanitarian access must guide the collective response. We strongly condemn all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including acts that may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We call upon all parties to take immediate measures to protect civilians and humanitarian personnel whose safety and security must be respected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Bulgaria calls for an immediate ceasefire. Bulgaria reiterates its support for the independent international fact-finding mission. Lasting peace in Sudan can only be achieved through the protection of civilians, full respect of international law, accountability for all violations, and an inclusive Sudanese-led political process. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Mr. Chair, we are meeting again today to discuss the atrocities targeting a new Sudanese city. We will condemn, we will denounce, we will reiterate our call to protect civilians. Isn't that what Egypt has warned against since the first day of this crisis? Didn't we warn that equating the Sudanese state with rebellious militias will encourage them to pursue their war and open the door to further atrocities and moving the catastrophe from one Sudanese city to another? We strongly condemn the atrocities by the RSF and Obeid. This reminds us what we have witnessed in Al Fasher and Junaina and other Sudanese cities. We reiterate that preserving the unity, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national institution of Sudan and to refuse any attempt to divide Sudan is the only way to preserve Sudan and its people's interests and rights. The priority today is to achieve a humanitarian truce that will pave the way for a comprehensive ceasefire and a political process that is owned and led by the Sudanese without any foreign interference. This council is requested to have a responsible position based on the mechanisms that enjoy approval and trust of Sudan. This is an indispensable pillar to achieve justice and to protect human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden. Okay. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President, High Commissioner. Spain aligns with the EU statement. We recognise the importance of this urgent debate in preventive work of this Council. With the siege by the RSF over El Obeid tightening, my country expresses its fear that there'll be a repeat of the already documented atrocities committed in El Fasher, including hallmarks of genocide. We condemn intensification of attacks with the growing use of drones against essential infrastructure and against civilians, whose 500,000 inhabitants, as alerted by the High Commissioner, run a high risk of suffering grave mass violations amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We join the call for an immediate cessation of the military escalation against El Obeid to guarantee compliance with IHL and human rights and to avoid a humanitarian disaster and an imminent massacre. President, we urge the parties to reach a ceasefire to guarantee access to humanitarian aid, respect sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity of the country, and not foster the creation of parallel state structures. We urge them to renew negotiations to promote national political and civil dialogue aimed at establishing a representative civilian government. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Our delegation welcomes the holding of this urgent debate and the proposed resolution presented in that context. Reports from the zone reflect how disastrous situation in Al Obeid is. 500,000 civilians are at risk of high-scale atrocities. Preventing a repeat of the devastating tragedy of El Fasher is crucial for this council, is a top priority for this council. We express our concern at the increasing use of drone attacks on civilian areas, destroying critical civilian infrastructure like hospitals, schools and universities. We condemn those actions which have left thousands of people trapped in conditions close to siege, denied basic essential services like water and fuel. We also state our strenuous consternation at the impact of this conflict on women and children, who bear the brunt, suffering disproportionately. We condemn the sustained use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, a situation which sadly we see increasingly frequently in current conflicts around the world. Sir, we make an urgent call to the parties to immediately cease hostilities, to guarantee rapid, safe, unimpeded humanitarian access and to abide strictly by IHL and human rights. Similarly, we reiterate the need for perpetrators to be brought to account for their crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to express our appreciation for the coordination by the core group and their flexibility throughout the process. Japan is deeply concerned by the reports of the escalation of military mobilization by Rapid Support Forces, RSF, and the allied forces in and around El Obeid in Sudan. This significantly increased the risk of violence against civilians and attacks on civilian infrastructure, as well as further escalation of the conflict in El Obeid, the Kordofan region, and beyond. Given these alarming developments, integrated and coordinated action is urgently needed to prevent further atrocities and protect civilians. El Obeid must not become another El Fasher. From this perspective, Japan supports both the primary purpose and the convening of this urgent debate. We join our partners in calling upon the RSF and their allied forces to immediately cease any actions that put innocent lives at risk, obstruct humanitarian access, or contribute to further atrocities and suffering. Japan, together with the countries concerned, has been urging the relevant parties in Sudan to respect human rights and de-escalate tensions, commit to an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and improve access to humanitarian assistance. Japan is committed to continuing those efforts towards improving the situation in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are appalled by the deteriorating situation in El Obeid. As we have heard repeatedly this morning, escalating drone strikes have killed civilians and destroyed civilian infrastructure. Key supply routes have been hit, along with fuel stations and the electricity grid. Access to basic services has been cut off for over 500,000 people and 100,000 already displaced. Last year, the world watched in horror as the Rapid Support Forces raped, pillaged and murdered their way through El Fasher. This cannot be repeated. As our Foreign Secretary has warned, El Obeid is on the precipice of an atrocity that will deepen the wounds already inflicted on Sudan. This Council must act with urgency to help prevent further harm to civilians. The UK has led efforts to urge de-escalation and adherence to international law so civilians can leave safely and reach desperately needed aid. This year, the UK is providing £146 million in aid, including £15 million for local responders, ensuring life-saving aid is delivered to the front lines of the conflict. However, aid alone is insufficient. Ending impunity is essential. The fact-finding mission remains vital in establishing accountability for crimes, including any committed in El Obeid. It must be granted full access across Sudan to carry out its mandate. The violence must end in Sudan. Civilians must be protected. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci.
Thank you, President. France expresses its grave concerns at the situation in El Obeid, where the civilian population are denied access to resources and basic services due to the siege by the RSF. The High Commissioner and the Security Council have both alerted as to the rapid deterioration of the situation on the ground, and we fear commission of mass atrocities. In that context, France urges the RSF to respect international humanitarian law by ceasing their attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure and putting an end to this strategy, of the siege strategy, which is indiscriminately impacting civilians. Immediate, safe, unimpeded access for humanitarian actors to those populations must be guaranteed. The RSF and the Sudanese armed forces are the main ones guilty for this conflict, which has destabilized the country and the whole region for a number of years. The humanitarian situation remains extremely troubling, marked by repeated violations of IHL and international human rights law by the belligerent forces that the fact-finding mission must document. France urges all parties to honour their commitments pursuant to the Jeddah Declaration, to consider confidence-building measures and reach a peaceful settlement of the conflict, the only way to guarantee a return to stability and peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia condemns the escalating violence by the RSF against civilians in Al Obeid, including the internally displaced. We are alarmed by drone attacks on civilian infrastructure, cutting off essential services that Al Obeid's people depend on to survive. This must end. We urge all states with influence to stop fueling its conflict and instead to support Sudan's path to peace and reaffirm its territorial integrity. If there is one message to this Council must send, it is civilians must be protected, a duty owed to all Sudanese by all parties, and the international community must constructively support Sudan in meeting it. That means three things. Press the RSF to hold its assault, and all parties to agree a durable ceasefire. Ensure rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Ensure credible, impartial accountability for violation by all parties, and we welcome the continued opening of the Adrer crossing as a vital humanitarian corridor. Finally, Indonesia notes the work of Sudan's National Investigation Committee for Accountability, and we support efforts of the African Union, the Office of the High Commissioner, and the League of Arab States toward peace and reconciliation. Only an inclusive, Sudanese-led and owned political process will bring lasting peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Before I continue, just to announce that the list of speakers is now closed. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
President, Kenya shares the concerns expressed by many delegations at the rapidly deteriorating situation in and around Obeid, North Kordofan, and welcome the efforts of the core group in calling for this urgent debate as a timely use of Council's prevention mandate. We express solidarity with the people of Sudan, particularly civilians facing siege conditions and displacement and insecurity. We echo the call for an immediate ceasefire by all parties without precondition, and the need for full respect of international humanitarian and human rights law. The protection of civilians, including women and children, must remain paramount, and the attacks against humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure must cease. We urge the rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance, including through cross lines and cross-border modalities, and call on the international community to scale up predictable, sustained, and equitable support to frontline states to address the increasing humanitarian burden and its broader socioeconomic and security impact on the Horn of Africa. Kenya reiterates that there is no military solution. A political resolution remains urgent anchored in the Sudanese-led, Sudanese-owned process that is inclusive and ensures that the meaningful participation of all stakeholders. We further stress the importance of coherence across international efforts in alignment with AU and IGAD-led initiatives. We emphasize the importance of accountability pursued in a manner that promotes dialogue and sustains engagement towards long-term stability. Kenya remains committed as a regional actor to support efforts towards de-escalating stability and sustainable peace in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement. We are strongly condemning the reported atrocities and are deeply alarmed with continued escalating violence in El Obeid, despite repeated calls for restraint and protection of civilians. Just 8 months ago, the fall of El Fasher led to tens of thousands of deaths and widespread ethnic targeting and sexual violence in what the UN fact-finding mission assessed as the hallmarks of genocide. We need to act today to prevent a similar tragedy leading to serious international crimes in El Obeid, with women and children bearing the biggest brunt of the conflict. The primary responsibility for bringing conflict in Sudan, including in El Obeid, to an end, rests with the leadership of both the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF and their affiliated militias, as well as those who provide them with arms, financing, and other forms of support. We call on the RSF to hold its offensive on El Obeid immediately. All parties to the conflict and those with influence over them must de-escalate, protect civilians, ensure safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access, and all support that fuels the conflict. All violations and abuses must be investigated and those responsible held accountable. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa thanks the core group for calling this urgent debate, which falls within the mandate of this Council as enshrined in its founding resolution, and joining us to contribute towards the prevention of human rights violations and respond promptly to human rights emergencies. The situation in El Obeid requires us to act in accordance with this mandate. Developments there closely mirror the Rapid Security Forces, the RSF's 18-month siege on El Fasher, leading to the mass killing of the innocent, which the Council's fact-finding mission characterized as bearing all the hallmarks of genocide. Sadly, the atrocities being committed in El Obeid are not new. As the High Commissioner recently warned, we have seen the script before. Beyond El Fasher, we saw it at the Zamzam IDP camp and in El Geneina. As a state party to the Genocide Convention, South Africa is obligated to act to ensure that preventable atrocities should never be repeated. What we need now is action within our mandate to protect the people of El Obeid, to ensure humanitarian access, and to press all parties towards a ceasefire. We reiterate that there can be no military solution to the conflict. Those responsible must be held accountable, including those who aid and abet them. All foreign interference and efforts to fragment Sudan must end. The flow of arms must stop, and the guns must be silenced. Above all, the human rights of the people of El Obeid must be protected. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, the Republic of Korea is deeply concerned over continued violence across Sudan, further exacerbating an already dire humanitarian situation. We are particularly alarmed that El Obeid, North Kordofan, now faces an imminent risk of large-scale atrocities, as the city, already gripped by siege-like conditions, is reportedly coming under intensified drone strikes. We condemn these attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and humanitarian convoys. As the High Commissioner has warned, we must not allow a repeat of these preventable atrocities. We are especially troubled by the disproportionate impact of this crisis on women and children, who face heightened risks of sexual and gender-based violence and displacement. The Republic of Korea once again urges all parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities, allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and fully comply with their obligations under international law. We also call on external actors to refrain from providing any support that fuels the conflict. Ensuring accountability remains essential. The Republic of Korea supports the mandate of the fact-finding mission, including its urgent inquiry into the situation in Obeid. We remain committed to working with the international community to ease the suffering of the Sudanese people and support the efforts for durable peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, for more than 3 years, the Sudan has remained in the grip of a devastating conflict with civilians bearing the heaviest cost. The situation in and around Obeid is particularly alarming, given reports of substantial rapid support forces reinforcements and the risk of a ground offensive. As noted by the High Commissioner in his statement of 18 June and others, the RSF's record of grave abuses and atrocities in El Fasher and elsewhere in the Sudan underscores the imminent risk of mass atrocities. The growing use of drones and advanced weaponry remains a matter of grave concern. The RSF must lift its siege of Obeid, halt its assault, comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and protect civilians. We call for safe, rapid, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, and stress that attacks on humanitarian personnel are indefensible. It remains imperative to abide by the 2023 Jeddah Declaration of Commitment to protect the civilians of Sudan. Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity must be preserved. Parallel governance structures must be firmly rejected. They would only prolong the conflict to which there is no military solution. Pakistan welcomes international and regional efforts to achieve an immediate ceasefire and to support an inclusive, Sudan-owned and Sudan-led political process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, sir. Mexico expresses its deep concern at the conflict in Sudan, which has been prolonged for over 3 years without any signs of a solution. This has led to a deterioration of the human rights and humanitarian situation, in particular in Obeid. We are facing a crisis which will not allow for a lack of action on the part of the international community. 11.5 people have been displaced by the conflict. We condemn in the firmest terms the attacks against civilians, hospitals, schools, and any civilian infrastructure. We are concerned about the disproportionate impact that violence and trauma stemming from conflict have on children. No child should have to grow living in fear of attacks, be deprived of education, or go without access to essential services. Mexico stresses the need to guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian access. All parties are compelled to uphold international humanitarian law, human rights, and refugee law, in line with Resolution 1556 of the Security Council. We reject any foreign interference, including the supply of weapons, which has been one of the driving forces of this conflict. Lastly, Mexico restates its support to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Sudan, including the right to use freely its natural resources. This is a necessary condition for the enjoyment of human rights. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, Albania aligns itself with the EU statement. Albania supports the request to convene this urgent debate and also the draft resolution presented by Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, and UK. My country is deeply concerned by the escalating violence against civilian infrastructure, and the growing risk of mass atrocity. We call all parties to immediately cease hostilities, respect international humanitarian law, protect civilians, and ensure rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. There cannot be a military solution to this conflict. Only an inclusive Sudanese owned and Sudanese lead political process with support of international partners can bring peace and stability. Accountability must remain central. Albania supports the work of fact-finding mission, including collecting documents and preserve evidence. At the critical moment, the Human Rights Council must speak with one voice to protect civilians, support accountability, and reaffirm that serious violation of international law cannot go unanswered. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is alarmed by the imminent threat of an RSF result on El Obeid. We align ourselves with the statements delivered by the EU and the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice in Sudan. We would like to highlight one aspect of this crisis, the unacceptable pervasiveness of conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan. Sexual violence used as a weapon of war is a serious violation of international law and may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. Such violations must stop. We call on all conflict parties to cease all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. We call for a survivor-centered response with access to medical, psychosocial and legal support. Holding perpetrators accountable lays the foundation for justice and sustainable peace, and we will continue to support accountability efforts such as the fact-finding mission. But more importantly, we must prevent the terrible harm inflicted on civilians in El Fasher from also befalling the civilians of El Obeid. We urge all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and those with influence over the parties to use that influence now to prevent further atrocities and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana is deeply concerned by the escalating violence in and around Al Obeid and the grave risk of further atrocities against civilians. Like others, we unequivocally condemn attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and call on all parties to the conflict, particularly the Rapid Support Forces, to immediately cease hostilities, respect international humanitarian and human rights law, and ensure civilian protection. We underscore the urgency of acting now to prevent a recurrence of the atrocities witnessed in El Fasher. We also stress that the continued flow of arms and external support following the conflict must cease. We underline the necessity for accountability for all war crimes committed in the ongoing armed conflict. Mr. President, we commend state and non-state actors that are cooperating with regional and international peace initiatives, particularly the African Union's Roadmap for Peace in Sudan, and call on all parties to implement existing peace processes, including the Jeddah Agreement, in order to protect civilians and facilitate the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance in Sudan. We finally reiterate our support for a coordinated international response led by the AU, IGAD, the UN, the League of Arab States, and key partners to advance a sustainable resolution of the crisis in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil has been following with great concern the situation in Al Obeid, as well as the escalating violence across the broader Kordofan and Darfur regions. We deeply regret that the Human Rights Council must once again convene an urgent meeting to address the ongoing conflict in Sudan, reflecting a lack of progress since the crisis erupted. Brazil strongly condemns the indiscriminate attacks and siege tactics deployed against civilian infrastructure and medical facilities in Al Obeid. We specifically condemn the widespread reports of sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, and the forced displacement of communities. We reiterate that starvation must never be used as a method of warfare. We call on all parties to immediately lift any blockades, ensure free and unimpeded humanitarian relief to Al Obeid, and guarantee the absolute protection of humanitarian workers. We recall the strict obligation of all actors to respect international human rights and international humanitarian law. Finally, we reiterate our support for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the fact-finding mission for Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. The Dominican Republic would like to welcome the convening of this urgent debate at a time which is extremely serious for the civilian population in El Obeid and its surrounding areas. We share the very deep concern voiced by the High Commissioner and by other delegations present here because of the rapid escalation of violence the deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the imminent risk that new atrocities will be committed against hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. We reject in the most categorical, firmest terms the attacks against the civilian population, key infrastructure and humanitarian personnel, as well as restrictions on access to food, water and medical assistance. We would like to join the appeal for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the resumption of an inclusive political process spearheaded by the Sudanese themselves, which would preserve the unity and territorial integrity of the country. We would like to restate that all parties to the conflict must guarantee the protection of the civilian population and facilitate rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. At the same time, we urge the international community and other relevant regional players to step up their diplomatic efforts and also cooperation to support mechanisms that are conducive to a viable and sustainable political solution on the ground. We reaffirm the importance of guaranteeing accountability. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
President, only 8 months after the Council's special session at the end of last year on the human rights situation in El Fasher, the situation in El Obeid and its surrounding areas has again raised concern. China has repeatedly stressed that the large-scale violence in El Fasher must never happen again. The basic human rights of the Sudanese people, including the right to life, must be effectively respected. The ISF should exercise restraint, ceasefire as soon as possible, and fulfill its obligations under international law. China reiterates that the debate in the Council should strictly follow its mandate, fully respect the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Sudan, and uphold the ownership of the Sudanese people. China always opposes the imposition of country-specific mechanisms without the consent of the country concerned. The fact-finding mission was established without the consent of Sudan, and the international community should not expand its mandate in disregard of Sudan's objections. It doesn't help resolve the issue, rather complicating it. We hope that the Council will, on the basis of respecting and listening to the views of the country concerned, seek consensus and promote a lasting solution through dialogue and negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy aligns with the EU statement and is deeply concerned about the deterioration of the human rights situation in the North Kordofan region, and specifically in and around El Obeid, which aggravates one of the world's most devastating humanitarian crises. We are alarmed by serious violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, including the restriction of humanitarian access and the use of drones against civilians, as reported by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We urge all parties to uphold international humanitarian law, protect civilians, and facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Italy is at the forefront of humanitarian assistance, supporting vulnerable civilians, especially children. Under the Italy for Sudan initiative, we have allocated fundings to provide essential services, deliver food and humanitarian supplies to the population. Italy continues to stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan and to work for a political solution to restore stability and security in the country, with respect for human rights and the rule of law as its core. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, President. Iraq condemns the human rights violations in Sudan, and more particularly in El Obeid. This is because of the targeting of medical infrastructure, and I would mention the National Fund for Medical Equipment and the Kordofan Center for Cancer. Medical infrastructure will be dismantled. There will be epidemics and contagious diseases. We condemn the targeting of educational centres, in particular the University of Kordofan. This hampers access to education. We have innocent people who are deprived of drinking water. Famine is being used as a weapon of war. There is a displacement, and the population is deprived of basic services. Children have been displaced. Iraq supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan. Problems must be resolved peacefully. We must return to negotiations, and we must reject violence and support sovereignty and territorial unity of Sudan, so as to put an end to this crisis and to guarantee security, safety, and stability in Sudan. We support the peace process in Sudan. We wish to preserve the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Sudan, and there must be no interference in its internal affairs and respect the choices that the Sudanese make. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia.
The Gambia, good morning, Mr. President. The Gambia joins this urgent debate with deep concern over the human rights situation in and around El Obeid, Sudan. We view this debate as an opportunity for the Council to help prevent further deterioration. The priority must be to protect civilians, prevent further loss of life, and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. At the center of the debate must be the Sudanese people. Their right to life, as recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, must be respected and protected. No military objective or political grievance can justify conduct that places civilians at risk or deprives them of humanitarian assistance. The Gambia stresses the need for full respect for the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of the Sudan. Any sustainable solution must be Sudanese-owned, African-led, and supported in a manner that strengthens peace, national cohesion, and civilian protection. All actors with influence over the situation must act responsibly. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and full respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The Gambia also recalls the Banjul Joint Declaration on Sudan of May 2026 as an important African contribution to civilian protection, evidence preservation, accountability, and victim-centered justice, and must be respected and translated into concrete action, and we submit. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned by the reports of dire humanitarian situation in and around Al Obeid. Ever since the current conflict started in Sudan in April 2023, the people of Sudan have been the worst affected. The conflict has caused immense loss of civilian life and wide-scale destruction of property. Heavy fighting, mass atrocities against civilians, and increasing fragmentation of the country are driving displacement and affecting the wider region. Refugee camps are inadequately equipped to handle such a huge scale of mass displacement within the country. The prolonged conflict has resulted in significant contraction in Sudanese economy in absolute terms, with widespread destruction of infrastructure, property, trade, and agricultural production. Sudan's population is facing acute food scarcity, extreme inflation, and leaving millions dependent on humanitarian assistance for survival. India has always attached great importance to its relations with the friendly people of Sudan. We have extended humanitarian assistance to Sudan in the form of medical supplies and food aid, including 27 tons of life-saving medicines and 2,000 metric tons of rice since 2023. These measures reflect India's continued commitment to supporting the people of Sudan during the ongoing conflict and humanitarian crisis. We stand by our friends in Sudan in their time of difficulty. Mr. President, we have consistently underscored the importance of engagement and reconciliation to resolve the conflict in Sudan. We reiterate our call for restraint, dialogue towards peace and stability in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement. We are alarmed by the unfolding situation in El Obeid and stress the imperative of preventing a repetition of El Fasher and the mass atrocities committed against innocent civilians. We call for the immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Sudan and for the protection of all civilians as foreseen under international humanitarian law. The horrific levels of sexual and gender-based violence witnessed in this conflict demand particular protection for women and girls, as well as robust action to end the weaponization of such violence. There cannot be impunity for these and other serious crimes committed in this conflict. Peace and reconciliation require justice and accountability.
At the same time, humanitarian aid must reach all Sudanese civilians, including in El Obeid, and the looting of aid must stop. Last, but by no means least, Cyprus underlines the importance of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan and ensuring its unity. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président. President, Switzerland condemns in the firmest terms the ongoing violence in Sudan, in particular in El Obeid. The repeated attacks by the Rapid Support Forces and their allies, including through the use of armed drones, violate international humanitarian law and worsen an already catastrophic situation marked by multiple human rights violations. We call on all parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to the violence and attacks against civilians. We can no longer remain silent as regards the role played by foreign actors fueling the conflict, as recalled by the Deputy High Commissioner in January last. Foreign powers provide various forms of military support which prolong hostilities and contribute to violations which have been broadly documented, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as has been pointed out by the fact-finding mission on El Fasher, these atrocities show distinctive signs of genocide. We call on foreign actors to immediately cease any military support, including by providing personnel, and to use their influence so as to prevent new atrocities. We would also recall the obligation to prevent, which is incumbent upon state parties who are party to the Convention on Genocide, and we support the extension of the arms embargo of the Security Council across the country, the Sudanese territory. Switzerland underscores finally that the perpetrators of international crimes must be responsible and held responsible for their acts before the justice system. I thank you.
Thank you. We shall now proceed with the list of observers of the Council, and we begin with the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation aligns itself with the EU statement. Belgium supports this urgent debate on the situation in El Obeid. As the High Commissioner said, we have seen this playbook before. Belgium is deeply concerned by widespread human rights violations and abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, and the dire humanitarian situation. We are also concerned by threats against human rights defenders in civil society whose work remains essential in documenting violations. We call on all parties to ensure the protection of civilians. In El Obeid, drone attacks, artillery shelling and attacks on humanitarian and life-sustaining services must cease. Unlike during the previous special session on El Fasher, we can and must exert pressure now to prevent further deterioration of an already dire situation. The Sudanese people deserve peace and accountability. We call on the RSF to immediately halt their assault on El Obeid and reiterate our call to all parties for a ceasefire. There can be no military solution. All states must apply maximum pressure on the RSF, the SAF, and their allies to prevent atrocities, protect civilians, and fully comply with IHL. External support must stop now. Finally, Belgium fully supports the mandate of the FFM and calls on all parties to cooperate with it and with international accountability mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Iran expresses its deep concern over the worsening human rights and humanitarian situation in and around El Obeid as the conflict in Sudan continues to spread. The world's failure to respond effectively to the tragedy in Sudan has allowed this catastrophe to move from one city to another. After the grave violations in El Fasher and Darfur, North Kordofan, and its capital, El Obeid now faces the same alarming pattern. Iran strongly condemns the continued supply of arms, financial, logistical, and military support, including advanced drone capabilities, and the recruitment and training of fighters to the rapid support forces by certain external actors. We call for the full respect for international humanitarian law, accountability for all external actors fueling this conflict, and equal treatment of all crises without double standards. Iran reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Sudan, rejects any form of foreign interference, including any attempt to impose a situation of dual governance, and stresses that only a Sudanese-led solution can secure lasting peace and stability. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the EU statement. Austria is gravely alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in El Obeid and the imminent risk of mass atrocities. We echo the High Commissioner's warning that the pattern of violence witnessed in El Fasher and Samsam must not be repeated. The militarization of El Obeid, including its strategic use as a potential launch base for drone operations, risks further escalating the conflict and undermining prospects for peace. Austria calls on the RSF to immediately halt their offense on El Obeid and to stop drone attacks on civilian infrastructure. Austria calls on all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law and grant unhindered humanitarian access, and urges all external actors to cease support that fuels this conflict and its atrocities and to uphold the arms embargo. We welcome the draft resolution, as independent and impartial investigations into all alleged violations and abuses of IHRL and IHL and full accountability for those responsible are essential to delivering justice for victims, ending impunity, and laying the foundations for lasting peace in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, President. Luxembourg aligns with the EU statement. We are deeply concerned by the deterioration of the situation in and around El Obeid. Drone attacks targeting key civilian infrastructure, growing shortages, and attacks against humanitarian players deprive the population of any means of survival. Once again, the most vulnerable people, in particular women and children, pay the heaviest price. It is our collective responsibility to afford them with protection. We restate our appeal, which was launched during this Council in November 2025, to prevent any repetition of violations committed in El Fasher in the Kordofan region. We urge the parties to immediately establish a humanitarian truce and to guarantee safe passage so as to evacuate the population. The repeated appeals by this Council and by the High Commissioner must not go unheeded. Luxembourg recalls the urgency of guaranteeing accountability for all violations of international law and international humanitarian law. The Sudanese people have demonstrated remarkable resilience and finally deserve peace, security and dignity. We call on all parties, as well as foreign players to the conflict, to imperatively work towards a de-escalation of violence, and we affirm our support to the Sudanese population. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, Liechtenstein is gravely concerned by the escalating violence and rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around El Obeid. 18 months of siege-like conditions, reports of a significant buildup of rapid support forces and allied forces, intensified drone strikes and artillery shelling point to an imminent risk of further mass atrocities against civilians. The horrors documented in Al Fasher and Samsam IDP camp, as vividly recalled at the beginning of this meeting, must not be repeated in El Obeid. International humanitarian and human rights law is not optional. Liechtenstein calls on all parties to immediately halt attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, allow safe, rapid and unhindered humanitarian access, and ensure safe passage for those seeking protection. We further reiterate our grave concern about external interference sustaining this conflict. The supply of weapons and equipment, financing and private military contractors prolongs the suffering of the Sudanese people and violates the Security Council's arms embargo. This must stop. The states providing such support bear direct responsibility for its consequences. This Council must act with urgency to prevent further atrocities, strengthen accountability, support the work of the fact-finding mission, and underscore the potential role of the International Criminal Court in ending impunity. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Since the start of the conflict in the Sudan, our kingdom has worked based on our responsibility vis-à-vis the brothers in Sudan, and we have made diplomatic efforts that led to the signing of the Jeddah Declaration in May 2023 in order to protect civilians, non-obstruction of humanitarian assistance, and respect of IHL and international law. Our priority is to achieve stability in the Sudan, to achieve an immediate ceasefire, and to protect the institutions of the Sudan. Dealing with the crisis in the Sudan needs a Sudanese political process that enhances the national institutions and respects the sovereignty of the Sudan. We express our concern at the buildup of the RSF and their siege of Obeid. We warn of the repetition of atrocities. We refuse any illegal measures that undermine the unity and sovereignty of Sudan. We welcome regional and international efforts to put an end to the crisis, and thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of UN Women.
Thank you, Mr. President. UN Women is deeply concerned by the escalating risk of mass atrocity in and around El Obeid. Intensifying hostility, growing displacement, shrinking humanitarian access, and rising protection risks are placing civilians, especially women and girls, in increasing danger. Further escalation could have devastating consequences for civilian protection, humanitarian operation, and stability across Kordofan and beyond. Entire communities are facing unimaginable hardship. Women and girls are exposed to heightened risk of gender-based violence, while access to life-saving health and protection services continues to deteriorate. We call all parties to prioritize three actions. First, reaffirm the protection of civilians and demand full respect for international humanitarian and human rights law, including accountability for conflict-related sexual violence and other grave violations. Second, call for safe, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access alongside strengthening gender-responsive protection services for women, girls, and other groups facing heightened risk. Third, recognize and invest in the leadership of Sudanese women's and local women's organizations whose frontline work is essential for protection, humanitarian response, and building pathways towards sustainable peace. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель.
Thank you, President. Discussing country situations in the Human Rights Council and adopting relevant decisions should take place with fully taking into account the position of the state concerned, which represents the interests of its people. It's important for heightened international attention to the situation in Sudan be very soon aimed at bolstering the capacities of the government to stabilize the situation, improve the humanitarian situation, and provide for the primary needs of its population, including for IDPs and refugees. Attempts to force on the government cooperation with any kind of non-consensual mechanisms runs counter to the principles of international cooperation based on sovereign equality of states. We reiterate the position of Belarus against country resolutions and politicized mandates which are not supported by the country concerned. We urge the international community to devote undivided attention to humanitarian activities and assistance to the population of the country, including through food assistance and rebuilding infrastructure. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, today's debate on the situation in another Sudanese city serves as a stark reminder of our collective failure to prevent what has now become the major humanitarian tragedy worldwide, our collective failure to shield the victims in Sudan and to protect their country from the mounting external interferences, and last but not least, our collective failure to champion dialogue over confrontation, mediation over interference, and reconciliation over division. For Algeria, today is the day to reaffirm the fundamental imperatives that must guide any genuine effort for the sake of peace in Sudan. First and foremost, uphold Sudan's sovereignty, national unity, and territorial integrity, while rejecting all attempts to fragment the country and its institutions. Secondly, condemn all those that continue from outside to fuel violence, to deepen the suffering, and to undermine every prospect for peace. Thirdly and lastly, work towards a Sudanese-led and Sudanese-owned political process that brings together all sons and daughters of Sudan to chart their own future through dialogue, unity, and reconciliation. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, Mr. President, our Council meets again to discuss the brotherly state of Sudan. We must take a clear stance. The situation in Obeid is a nightmare for civilians. They face an escalating humanitarian crisis due to a long siege and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. This led to a lack of water, food, and basic services. Tens of thousands of civilians face life-threatening danger. Jordan reaffirms the importance of stopping any escalation and respect for IHL and international law, and to provide protection for civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for unhindered humanitarian assistance and safe passage for IDPs, and this stems from our stand that respects the sovereignty of Sudan. We call on the international community to put an end to the crisis, and that would provide a safe future for Sudan. The Council has an important mandate. We hope it will effectively protect the civilians and to enhance accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco.
شكرا السيد رئيس. يعرب المغرب أن بالغ.
Thank you, President. We're gravely concerned by the situation in Sudan following the bloody events in Obeid. We condemn the threats to life and safety of innocent civilians, especially of women and children. We stand in solidarity with this kindred country of Sudan during these painful circumstances. We call on the international community to provide necessary humanitarian assistance. We need to guarantee supply of this aid without obstacles so as to mitigate the suffering of civilians who suffer from malnutrition and shortages of drinking water. We call for support to be given to efforts to bolster national institutions, to relaunch dialogue and reconciliation. There is a need to support initiatives that address the root causes of the conflict. We must preserve national sovereignty, territorial integrity of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are alarmed by reports of a possible RSF ground offensive in El Obeid, alongside deadly drone strikes that have damaged fuel depots, water stations, and health services, placing at least 500,000 people at grave risk and leaving families without reliable access to basic necessities. The warning signs echo those seen in Al Fashir, and we are deeply concerned that similar atrocities could unfold in the near future in El Obeid. An immediate de-escalation is urgently required. All parties must comply fully with applicable international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and take precautions to protect the civilian population and civilian objects against the effects of attacks, including the use of drones and shelling. They must also allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian aid to El Obeid and surrounding areas. We also urge all external actors to cease the supply of weapons and financial support that fuels the conflict. Canada supports essential UN and regional accountability efforts, including those of the African Commission and the FFM for Sudan to document violations and advance accountability for atrocity crimes, and we support a strong resolution to reinforce these efforts. We urge all parties to the conflict and those with influence over them to use every diplomatic avenue available to secure an immediate ceasefire and advance a credible path toward a negotiated and lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. We join the High Commissioner and the conveners of this urgent debate in expressing our deepest concern at reports of serious human rights violations and abuses in and around El Obeid, north of Kordofan, and at the risk of further deterioration with grave consequences for civilians. We share the High Commissioner's alarm and echo his call for urgent preventive action. As we meet here again, regrettably, the people of Sudan have endured repeated violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including sexual and gender-based violence. These violations must cease immediately. Malta calls on all actors, foreign and domestic, with influence on the RSF and the SAF to halt and prevent all forms of violations, protect civilians, and to ensure that their actions are contributors to peace and not to violence. All actors, regardless of their allegiance, have an obligation to uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to hold violators accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. Peru expresses profound concern at the humanitarian situation, human rights situation in and around El Obeid, in a context of grave human rights violations against civilians in that's taking place in Sudan. And we want to share the consternation expressed by the High Commissioner, who on 20th of June spoke of the imminent risk of new atrocities being committed, loss of human life, and exacerbation of the severe conditions facing civilians. With emphasizing the key factor of prevention, it's crucial to act timely and effectively and in coordinated fashion. Therefore, Peru urges all parties to reach an immediate ceasefire, to protect civilians and ensure full respect for IHL and international human rights law. It's also crucial to guarantee humanitarian access, enable passage for people who wish to leave conflict zones and protect key civilian infrastructure. Lastly, Peru reiterates its support to the fact-finding mission, reiterates the need to investigate all violations and abuses committed, ensure accountability, and move towards peaceful, inclusive, sustainable solution to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns with the statements of the EU and the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice for Sudan. Ireland is deeply concerned by the RSF's ongoing offensive on El Obeid. Their established modus operandi is clear. If El Obeid falls, there is a grave risk of mass atrocities being committed against civilians, including widespread and systematic conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Ireland strongly condemns the pervasive and deliberate targeting of the civilian population and critical infrastructure, including through the increasing use of drone strikes. Throughout this conflict, the RSF has used starvation as a method of warfare, with El Obeid enduring recurring siege-like conditions for over 3 years now. Ireland calls urgently on the RSF to end the siege of El Obeid. We also call on the parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities and to adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. Civilians, including humanitarian personnel, must be protected. Civilians must be able to leave the city safely, and all parties must ensure rapid, unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access. It is vital that all states with influence advocate for a peaceful resolution of the conflict and refrain from any actions that could fuel further violence. Finally, President, we reiterate our full support to the OHCHR and the UN fact-finding mission for Sudan. Impunity will not be tolerated. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns with the EU statement.
We are deeply alarmed by the imminent risk of mass atrocities in and around El Obeid. The people of Sudan have already endured unimaginable suffering. They must not be condemned to yet another humanitarian catastrophe. We call on all parties to the conflict to cease hostilities immediately, protect civilians, refrain from targeting public infrastructure, guarantee full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, including through effective humanitarian corridors, and fully respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also call on all those who arm, finance, or otherwise sustain the conflict to end their support without delay. Their actions fuel further violence and human suffering. Accountability is indispensable. Those responsible for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuse must be brought to justice through credible and independent mechanisms. Impunity only paves the way for further atrocities. Greece actively supports the European Union's diplomatic, humanitarian, and accountability efforts in Sudan. At the national level, Greece is also providing humanitarian assistance through HCR, WHO, and other UN agencies. The international community must act decisively and with urgency to ensure an immediate ceasefire and an inclusive political process, with full respect for Sudan's unity and territorial integrity. We have been warned of the risks. We must not fail the people of Sudan by allowing another mass atrocity. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Thank you, Mr. President. Moldova aligns with the EU statement. The Republic of Moldova is deeply concerned about the ongoing conflict in Sudan and the worsening situation in El Obeid. Therefore, we supported the organization of this urgent debate as an exercise of the Human Rights Council preventive role. We condemn the escalating violence committed by the rapid support forces in and around El Obeid. The continuation of ground offensive in El Obeid creates imminent risk of mass atrocities, summer executions, abductions, arbitrary detention, sexual and gender-based violence against civilians. We call on RSF to immediately cease the attacks, including the drone strikes that endanger the lives of the civilians. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and human rights law and fully implement the Jeddah Declaration. We reiterate our call on the parties to reach an agreement on an immediate and lasting ceasefire in line with the Berlin Principles for Sudan and with full respect for Sudan's territorial integrity and sovereignty. We also urge all external actors to refrain from interference which further fuels the conflict. Accountability must be ensured and impunity must be prevented, and in this context we support the mandate of the fact-finding mission. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns with the EU statement and that of the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention. We address this Council, like others, with deep concern for El Obeid, where civilians face imminent threat from the RSF's ground offensive. We welcome that the Council comes together today to address this situation with the aim of preventing further violence. The High Commissioner's warnings of mass atrocities must be heeded. We cannot allow another El Fasher. Germany urges the RSF to halt its assault and all parties to cease hostilities. Civilians must move safely and attacks on hospitals, water supplies and humanitarian aid must stop. Such acts violate international humanitarian law and may constitute war crimes. The responsibility to end this war lies with the SIF and RSF leadership, as well as those who arm or finance them. Nobody should ignore the obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. We urge all external actors to cease support for this conflict immediately, as agreed upon in the Berlin Principles. At the Berlin Sudan Conference in April, the international community pledged nearly 1.5 billion euros to assist Sudan's people. Sudanese civilians also adopted a joint call, a powerful appeal for peace. Germany supports the Quad and Quintet to push for a ceasefire and a Sudanese-led political process. We will continue to support the fact-finding mission and the ICC, ensuring that justice prevails. Mr. President, the people of El Obeid deserve urgent action. Germany calls on all influential states to act now. We reaffirm our commitment to Sudan's unity, territorial integrity, and its people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. We listened carefully to the briefers who provided a sobering account of the unfolding horrors in and around El Obeid. The ongoing escalation is a stark reminder that there is no military solution to this conflict and that the only viable path forward is an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and an urgent humanitarian truce. The UAE unequivocally reiterates its strongest condemnation of all violations of international law committed by both warring parties across Sudan, including the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. In this vein, the UAE calls for an expansion of the existing UN arms embargo across the whole territory of Sudan as a necessary measure to halt hostilities and ensure the protection of civilians. And we must also guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all affected areas. As a member of the Sudan Quad, we welcome in particular the outcomes of the Berlin Conference and the space it provides for Sudanese civilians, as well as the Quintet's ongoing efforts to advance the civilian track. The international community's main objective must remain a comprehensive civilian-led political process independent from both warring parties and extremist groups that reflects the aspirations of the Sudanese people. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia is deeply alarmed by developments in El Obeid and reports of an imminent offensive by the Rapid Support Forces that could lead to atrocities against besieged civilians. Inhabitants of El Obeid are trapped and cut off from basic services, raising fears of a repeat of the horrors committed in El Fasher. We are gravely concerned by the reported repeated patterns of human rights abuses committed during this conflict. We call on the Rapid Support Forces to immediately cease its offensive on El Obeid. Drone strikes on fuel stations and trucks have caused serious fuel and water shortages, deepening the humanitarian crisis. Australia urges all parties to de-escalate, protect civilians, facilitate full, safe, rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access, and ensure the protection of humanitarian personnel in accordance with international humanitarian law. We call on the Rapid Support Forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces and all parties to the conflict to agree to a permanent ceasefire and to respect human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Mr. President, Rwanda aligns with the statement delivered by Kenya on behalf of the Africa Group. We express our solidarity with the people of Sudan and remain concerned by the security and humanitarian situation in and around El Obeid. We stress the importance of full respect for the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and underline the need to facilitate humanitarian access and support efforts that contribute to de-escalation and accountability in a manner that advances peace and reconciliation. Rwanda reaffirms respect for Sudan's sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity, and stresses that there can be no sustainable military solution to the conflict. In this regard, Rwanda supports the ongoing efforts of the African Union and IGAD and coordinated regional and international engagement to accompany an inclusive Sudanese-led and Sudanese-owned political dialogue. In conclusion, we encourage all partners to align behind African-led efforts and avoid duplication in order to achieve the aspirations of the Sudanese people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine expresses profound concern over the rapidly deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in El Obeid and in the wider Kordofan region. We are deeply alarmed that approximately 500,000 civilians remain at risk of large-scale atrocities and escalating military activities, intensified drone strikes, and prolonged siege-like conditions that have deprived thousands of people of access to basic services. Ukraine strongly condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including deliberate attacks against civilian infrastructure and other actions that directly endanger the lives, safety and dignity of civilians. These violations have further deepened the humanitarian crisis, systematically eroded access to essential services, and left already vulnerable populations in an increasingly precarious situation. We echo the warning of High Commissioner regarding the imminent risk of serious international crimes, including summary executions, arbitrary detention, abductions, sexual violence, and further forced displacement. The scale and pattern of reported violations demand urgent international attention and decisive actions. Ukraine calls to immediately de-escalate hostilities, ensure unhindered humanitarian access, and fully comply with obligations under international law. We stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan and reaffirm our support to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Republic of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Portugal aligns with the EU statement. The people of Sudan continue to endure the catastrophic consequences of a conflict that inflicts immense suffering. Portugal is deeply alarmed by reports of a significant military build-up by the RSF in and around El Obeid, alongside intensified drone strikes and artillery shelling, raising the imminent risk of mass atrocities against civilians. We echo the High Commissioner's warning that urgent action is needed to prevent further military escalation and protect civilians. We call on all parties to cease hostilities immediately and to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Civilians must be protected. Rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured, and all allegations of violations and abuses must be thoroughly investigated so that those responsible are held accountable. No durable solution can be achieved through military means. A sustainable future for Sudan requires an inclusive, civilian-led political process with the meaningful participation of women, youth, civil society, and the communities from all regions of the country. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela expresses its solidarity with the Sudanese people in the face of the conflict in El Obeid. We profoundly regret the loss of human life and the delicate humanitarian situation. We note with concern the intensification of the conflict, with reports of foreign interference and support being given to armed groups which have attacked civilian populations and essential infrastructure. We reiterate that any initiative aimed at peace should respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity and right of the Sudanese people to freely determine their own future, in step with international law and the principle of non-interference. We stress that cooperation and technical assistance can only contribute effectively to improving the human rights situation when they enjoy the consent of the country concerned. In that regard, we welcome Sudan's willingness to continue cooperating with OHCHR. We believe that it's only through dialogue and genuine cooperation that we can build lasting peace for the benefit of the Sudanese people and of their human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Sudan's unity, territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence are the basic tenets of our principled approach to the region and Africa. Most recent and continued attacks on El Obeid by the RSF militia cause further escalation and aggravate the suffering of the Sudanese people. We are deeply alarmed by deteriorating humanitarian situation and violations of IHL. We join international community's call for an end to violence in and around El Obeid. However, we believe a corrective is imperative on the part of us, the international community. We join others who underscore that there are no two equal sides to this. Every instance that the RSF and its affiliates are treated as equals with legitimate institutions, this ends up reinforcing the belief that they can continue their violence with impunity. While international initiatives are valuable in keeping Sudan high on the agenda, their ability to contribute to a lasting solution is proving limited in the absence of Sudan's legitimate representatives. Weakening and delegitimizing state institutions in the country without any viable alternatives end up delaying the potential for sustained peace and order. In these difficult times, Turkey will continue to provide humanitarian aid to ease the suffering of the Sudanese people. Turkish authorities and companies, therefore, continue to maintain their presence and activities in Sudan and support the Sudanese people and their legitimate representatives. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Mali thanks the Human Rights Council for organising this urgent debate and would like to commend those who have initiated it. My delegation would point out that the human rights situation in Obeid, the capital of North Kordofan, is quite alarming. Under the threat of a siege of terrorist forces, the city, which hosts displaced persons fleeing violence and in its surrounding areas, is facing extremely difficult living conditions, with families living in precarious camps deprived of basic social services. Furthermore, Mali is alarmed by the information which reports that there's been a step up in attacks against key civilian infrastructure by terrorist attacks, and these attacks were targeted against hospitals, schools, and sites hosting displaced persons. My delegation urges the Sudanese government to expedite the implementation of the peace initiative presented to the Security Council on the 22nd of December 2025. To conclude, Mali reaffirms its ongoing commitment to uphold sovereignty, territorial integrity, the independence and political unity of Sudan, and expresses its solidarity to the government and to the Sudanese people. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chad. All right. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
Mr. President, Timor-Leste welcomes the convening of this urgent debate. We are deeply alarmed by the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in and around El Obeid, North Kordofan, as civilians continue to bear the devastating consequences of the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Report on this indiscriminate attacks, civilian casualties, destructions of civilian infrastructure, and impediments of humanitarian access are deeply concerning. Timor-Leste reiterates that all parties to the conflict must fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Civilians, including women, children, older persons, and persons with disability, must be protected, and humanitarian actors must be granted safe, rapid, and unhindered access to those in need. Timor-Leste remains concerned by the continued climate of impunity for serious violations and abuses. As a nation that has experienced conflict and has pursued reconciliations grounded in justice and respect for human dignity, Timor-Leste believes that a sustainable resolutions can only be achieved through inclusive dialogue, respect for international law, and the protections of the rights of all people. We call on all parties to cease hostilities, engage in good faith efforts toward peaceful resolutions, and place the welfare and dignity of the Sudanese people at the center of all actions. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
President, Montenegro aligns with the EU statement. Montenegro supports the urgent debate and the draft resolution, convinced that the prevention of mass atrocities is a shared responsibility. After over 18 months of siege-like conditions, developments in and around El Obeid oblige this Council to act. The offensive by the Rapid Support Forces and their allies has placed hundreds of thousands of civilians at imminent risk of mass atrocities. The warning signs are clear, the risks are known, and the time to act is now, before El Obeid becomes another El Fashar. All parties in the conflict must comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. They must protect civilians, ensure humanitarian access, and respect humanitarian personnel. Failure to uphold these obligations cannot go unanswered. Preventing further atrocities and ensuring accountability are inseparable. Accountability is indispensable to justice, the prevention of further atrocities, and sustainable peace. Montenegro therefore reiterates its strong support for OHCHR and the fact-finding mission, whose work remains essential to advancing accountability, and calls on all conflict parties to cooperate fully with them. Mr. President, there is no military solution. The only path to sustainable peace is an immediate ceasefire and an inclusive civilian-led and Sudanese-owned political process in full respect of the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Sudan. Our response must match both the urgency of the situation and the responsibility entrusted to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
President, the situation in Sudan, unfortunately, is far from stable. The government and its armed forces continue to keep at bay destructive elements that have decided to challenge not just the stability and security of civilians, but the legitimacy of the existing Sudanese leadership. Latest events in and around El Obeid should leave no doubts the real goals of the opponents of peace, sow chaos around the country and create conditions for the country's dismemberment. To prevent such a scenario, it's necessary to emphasize not just on the consequences of the conflict now into its fourth year, but also on its root causes. To do this, the international community must recognize the need for a more constructive approach towards the situation in Sudan. It's crucial to fully take into account the position and wishes of the country's government, which is the sole guarantor of the integrity of the Sudanese state institutions and, in turn, Sudanese statehood. Everyone knows what the solution to this hot stage of the conflict is. It lies in forging frank, constructive cooperation with the country's legitimate authorities. The practice of the Council of creating corresponding monitoring mechanisms and regularly expanding their powers clearly isn't helping. We urge the Council to finally give up on politicising the Sudanese file and move towards providing genuine assistance to the government in normalising the situation in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
I thank you, Mr. President. At a time when the people of Sudan continue to endure severe humanitarian consequences of the crisis, the Council must move beyond routine discussions that do not translate into concrete outcomes. The continued escalation of the conflict is aggravated by the involvement of external actors whose actions have contributed to prolonging the violence and the killing of innocent people. Serious and concrete measures must be taken against those actors supporting the rapid support forces who have been committing serious crimes against civilians. Eritrea reiterates that a Sudanese-owned and inclusive political process remains the only viable pathway towards resolving the crisis. What is urgently needed is not another debate, but a genuine commitment for peace and stability, humanitarian relief, and an inclusive political process. The situation in Sudan requires a decisive action. The international community must prioritize ending this devastating conflict and deliver the needed assistance on the ground. Eritrea reaffirms its strong commitment to Sudan's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity, and rejects any attempts undermining these principles and creating parallel governing structures outside the government of Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, South Sudan aligned with the African Group statement and thanks the High Commissioner for the update on the human rights situation in and around El Obeid, North Kordofan, and welcome His Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sudan, Ambassador Meheddin Salim, and his accompanying delegation. We remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the humanitarian and human rights situation in and around El Obeid, North Kordofan. As a neighboring country, South Sudan has witnessed firsthand the devastating regional consequences of this crisis. We therefore reiterate our steadfast support for an immediate cessation of hostilities to pave the way to humanitarian relief and peaceful Sudanese-owned and Sudanese-led political process aimed at restoring peace, stability, and national unity. We reaffirm our position that existing mechanisms and continued engagement of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights provide an appropriate framework for maintaining developments and supporting Sudan national efforts, as establishment of any new human rights mechanism risk duplicating existing mandates and diverting resources. South Sudan remains committed to working with regional and international actors in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect to support the people of Sudan in achieving lasting peace, protecting human rights, and addressing the root causes of the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, Somalia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Kenya on behalf of the African Group. The Federal Republic of Somalia is deeply concerned by the grave humanitarian and human rights situation in and around Obeid. We strongly condemn all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, particularly those carried out by the RSS, continue to endanger innocent lives and undermine peace and stability. We call on the international community to scale up humanitarian assistance and recovery support for the people of Sudan in coordination with and under the leadership of the government of Sudan. The vulnerable populations, women, children, and the elderly pay the highest price in this conflict. Somalia reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Republic of the Sudan. We also reaffirm our support for the African Union roadmap and continued efforts by the African Union and IGAD with the support of the United Nations and relevant partners towards a Sudanese-owned political process. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of Zambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Zambia is deeply concerned by the rapidly deteriorating situation in and around Obeid and the warnings of an imminent escalation that could place hundreds of thousands of civilians at grave risk. We call upon all parties to comply fully with international humanitarian law and international human rights law and to protect civilians without exception. How would we measure whether today's urgent debate has made a difference, Mr. President? Zambia believes our success should be measured not only by the statements delivered today, but by whether violence is de-escalated, humanitarian access expanded, and African mediation gains renewed momentum. We therefore reaffirm our support for peace efforts led by the AU and Intergovernmental Authority on Development with the support of the United Nations. We encourage all parties with influence over the parties to use that influence responsibly to support dialogue, implement existing commitments, and create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Ultimately, the credibility of preventive diplomacy will not be measured by the urgency of our deliberations, but by whether they help save lives, avert further atrocities, and restore hope to the people of Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to a distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Expresses deep concern over the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in and around Obeid. We extend our sincere sympathy and solidarity to the government and people of Sudan. We are deeply concerned by the continued attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure and the growing suffering caused by the ongoing conflict. Nigeria reiterates the need for full respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We underscore the importance of protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, ensuring safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and holding those responsible for violations and abuses accountable in accordance with international law. Nigeria reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and the territorial integrity of Sudan. We remain convinced that a lasting solution can only be achieved through a Sudanese-owned and Sudanese-led political process supported by the African Union, IGAD, and the international community. Nigeria believes that international efforts should complement existing mechanisms and avoid creating mandates without the consent of the state concerned. Greater support should instead be directed towards strengthening existing mechanisms through technical assistance and capacity building to promote sustained peace and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, Slovakia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We are deeply alarmed by the rapidly worsening situation in Obeid, where civilians continue to bear the highest burden of the ongoing conflict. The international community have a responsibility to ensure that the tragic events witnessed in El Fasher are not repeated elsewhere. The protection of civilians remains an absolute priority. All parties to the conflict must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. They must refrain from widespread attacks, ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. We are deeply concerned by the continued flow of arms and foreign fighters into Sudan in support of the RSF, which further fuels the conflict, aggravates civilian suffering, and undermines prospects for peace. We call on all external actors to refrain from any actions that contribute to further escalation and to fully respect their obligations under international law. Slovakia also reiterates that violations of international law must not go unpunished. Accountability is essential for justice and for preventing further future atrocities. We call on all parties to cease hostilities and engage in meaningful efforts towards a peaceful and sustainable resolution of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for convening this urgent debate. As a member of the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice for Sudan, we align ourselves with this statement. We are gravely alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in and around El Obeid, a city of 500,000 people, including over 100,000 internally displaced persons. We take seriously the High Commissioner's warning that an offensive on El Obeid risks further mass atrocities. We urge the Rapid Support Forces to immediately cease their siege-like acts and call for safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. After more than 3 years of atrocities, including the displacement of millions and widespread conflict-related sexual violence, we are not persuaded that existing mandates and mechanisms are sufficient. We therefore welcome this debate and the draft resolution. Sierra Leone's commitment to international humanitarian law is rooted in our recent history. It is for this reason that we support requesting the independent international fact-finding mission on Sudan to conduct an urgent inquiry into the grave violations detailed by the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. Accountability remains essential. Sierra Leone stands in solidarity with the people of Sudan. We urge all states with influence to act now to help secure an immediate cessation of hostilities, protect civilians, and ensure respect for IHL and international human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This urgent debate reflects the serious situation in and around El Obeid and the urgent need to highlight the suffering of the civilians in brotherly Sudan. Lebanon expressed its deep concern regarding the escalation of hostilities in and around El Obeid and the risk of further deterioration of humanitarian situation, as well as imminent risks of mass atrocities, as warned by the High Commissioner. Lebanon condemns the serious violations of IHL and international human rights law, including killing, starvation, forced displacement, targeting humanitarian staff, and destroying medical and other infrastructure. Lebanon joins the calls to end hostilities, to take all necessary measures to protect civilians, and to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. Lebanon reiterates the importance of accountability and responsibility vis-à-vis the crimes and violations, to end impunity and to achieve justice to the victims. We call to intensifying regional and international efforts to achieve a lasting political solution and an inclusive national dialogue led by the Sudanese to fulfill the aspirations of all the components of the Sudanese people and lays the foundation of a lasting peace. Lebanon reiterates its attachment to Sudan's unity, sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, stability, and its people's dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
Thank you, Mr. President. We follow with great interest the developments in Al Obeid. We express our concern at the humanitarian consequences of the crisis on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We affirm the importance of protecting the civilians and ensuring safe, unhindered humanitarian access in accordance with IHL and international legitimacy. We reaffirm of We reaffirm the importance of the language of dialogue and peaceful solutions. We call on all parties to engage in a process that leads to peace and security. Oman reaffirms again its support to international and regional efforts aimed at putting an end to the conflict in the brotherly country of Sudan. We call on the international community to make sure humanitarian access is provided in and around El Obeid in order to reduce humanitarian suffering and to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Thank you, President. There are times in which history confronts us and asks us how we believe it should be written, bearing in mind our own actions and conduct. That history may contain a whole raft of hostile and violent attitudes or be plagued with obstinate and stubborn attempts to achieve peace. How long from the four corners of the earth will we continue to be silent witnesses of bloodied faces of innocent Sudanese children, of families treading paths without a destination, and of lifeless bodies scattered in graveyards? Who wins with these actions, and how much do they win? The Sudanese people that have suffered so much cannot bear to live without any future prospects and without a glimmer of hope. That is why we must speak out to establish peace and to put an immediate end to this war, where the only victory for the time being is collective pain without any solace. Precisely today, this Council is taking up a principle that Africa taught all of us. That is the principle of a lack of indifference. This is the recognition that the suffering of a people can never be considered to be an unrelated matter, and that sovereignty finds its greatest strength when it is placed at the service of the protection of life and human dignity. Argentina, as a peace-loving people, we would like to ensure that Sudan recovers peace and constitutes the spirit that inspires the paragraphs that future books will write about the history of Sudan.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to express our full solidarity with the brotherly people of Sudan, considering the deteriorating human suffering due to the continuation of the armed conflict, especially in and around El Obeid. The State of Palestine follows with grave concern the reports that refer to the continuing deterioration of security and humanitarian situations and the grave violations of IHL and human rights law, including the targeting of civilian infrastructure, and obstructing humanitarian assistance. This escalates the suffering of the people. Our position is steadfast, which is there must be an immediate end to the hostilities, the protection of civilians, and full abiding fully by international law, and to guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance. We also reaffirm the importance of accountability for all violations and the importance of fighting impunity. We call on the international community to escalate efforts to protect civilians and to find a peaceful solution that preserves the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Holy See.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Holy See follows with grave concern the deteriorating situation in and around El Obeid. This Council is aware of what happened in El Fasher. It is the responsibility of the international community to ensure that this tragedy is not repeated. International humanitarian law binds all parties without exceptions. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and the protection owed to places of worship and hospitals, to the displaced persons and relief workers, are not optional in war. They are its limits. My delegation is particularly concerned by the tightening obstruction of humanitarian access and the siege-like conditions in which food, water, and fuel are scarce, and essential city services are under attack. Starving civilians can never be a method of warfare. Moreover, El Obeid is a vital lifeline through which relief reaches Darfur and much of Kordofan. Cutting it off would endanger far more than one city. Amid this suffering, the Catholic Church is present on the ground, caring for the displaced and providing food, water, sanitation, and health care. There is no military solution to this crisis in Sudan. My delegation reiterates the appeal of Pope Leo XIV to the warring parties to silence their weapons and begin without preconditions a sincere dialogue aimed at ending this fratricidal war as soon as possible. All parties must comply with international humanitarian law, protect and uphold human rights, step back from any assault upon El Obeid, open safe corridors for those in need, and ensure unimpeded humanitarian access. The complete version of this statement will be available online. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. We are following with major concern the developments of the humanitarian situation in Sudan, and more particularly in El Obeid and in the surrounding areas. This threatens the lives of civilians and leads to a worsening of suffering. We firmly condemn the attacks against civilians and civilian targets, and also foreign interference, which worsens the armed conflict. We condemn support to illegal non-governmental parties, and we reject any attempt to undermine the state institutions or to impose a parallel state outside of the legitimate constitutional framework. We support the regional and international efforts so as to reach a solution which would maintain the unity of Sudan, its stability and sovereignty across the country. We very much hope that this debate will make it possible to find a consensus-based solution so as to respect the sovereignty of the state and strengthen cooperation with Sudan by preventing the implementation of non-based mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Thank you, Mr. President. We express our grave concern at the reports on the siege of El Obeid and the threats to civilians there, especially that El Obeid hosts many civilians that have fled from Darfur. We call for an immediate ceasefire and to lift the siege and to respect IHL and international human rights law. We also condemn any violations against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and accountability is a must. We reaffirm our full solidarity with the brotherly people of the Sudan. We also support international and regional initiatives to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Sudan and to help the suffering of the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We align ourselves to the Kenyan statement on behalf of the African group. We express our deep concerns regarding the conflict in the brotherly Sudan, namely what's happening in El Obeid and around it, north of Kordofan, namely military escalation, deteriorating humanitarian situation. We denounce the crimes and the widespread violations against civilians. We call for an immediate ceasefire in order to end the suffering of the brotherly Sudanese people, implement Jeddah's agreement to secure the protection of the civilians, and to allow safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access according to international humanitarian law. We reiterate our steadfast position supporting the unity of brotherly Sudan, its independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity. We reject any interference in internal affairs of Sudan. We consider that the priority should be to the national interests and to seek peaceful solutions by resuming the intra-Sudanese dialogue until a peaceful settlement is achieved, led by the Sudanese. This is the best solution to end the catastrophe on the Sudanese people. We reiterate the importance of mediation at the international and national and regional level, namely the efforts by the AU, IGAD, the support of the United Nations and League of Arab States, as well as other international partners, based on the African roadmap to find a solution to the Sudanese crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That was the last speaker on my list. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And I give the floor to the representative of Eliska Relief Foundation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Eliska thanks the Council for holding this urgent debate on the catastrophic situation in Obeid. President, we're on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe that could rival the atrocities committed by the RSF in El Fasher in October 2015. The RSF's massive military build-up around the city will expose some 500,000 civilians to risk of mass atrocities amidst a suffocating siege and ongoing targeting of infrastructure and essential services. We can't list all the violations committed by the RSF, which is supported by the United Arab Emirates, against the city in recent months, but it suffices to note that between January and June 2026, 16 civilian and service sites in El Obeid were targeted or destroyed. These included hospitals, schools, power stations, fuel stations, a camp for IDPs, and aid convoys in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Therefore, Eliska calls on the Human Rights Council to firmly condemn the RSF's military build-up and demand an immediate end to its attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the city. It also calls on all states supporting the RSF to cease any support that prolongs the conflict or contributes to further violations, and to ensure that perpetrators are not allowed to escape punishment. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
3 weeks ago, we urged the Council to bridge the gap between the gravity of the Sudan crisis and the attention the country gets. Those who were unaware of the scale and gravity of atrocity crimes before the FFM's El Fasher report can no longer claim ignorance. As we speak, El Obeid faces the risk of atrocities as a result of an RSF offensive. Mr. President, the call we issued is more than a call for a debate. It's a plea. The Council shouldn't react to one atrocity crisis after another, but move into a different phase of its action on Sudan, shaping consequences for perpetrators. Our immediate asks are simple. Request the FFM to conduct an inquiry and ensure that it has adequate resources to report. Beyond these, we urge bolder steps. 1. Clearly condemn external actors fueling atrocities in Sudan, including the UAE, without giving a free pass to SAF and their backers. 2. Encourage the FFM to work with other accountability mechanisms. 3. Recommend that the General Assembly submit all FFM reports to the Security Council. The criminal and political costs for those who contribute to Sudan's nightmare should be maximum. If it's not, we'll be condemned to doing more of the same, holding more urgent debates, convening more special sessions, responding to one atrocity crisis after another without attempting to break the cycle of impunity. It's an insanity trap.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Human Rights Research League for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Human Rights Research League is deeply concerned by the escalating rapid support forces drone strikes on El Obeid in preparation for a ground offensive that would put hundreds of thousands of civilians at grave risk. These ongoing strikes are killing civilians, destroying and blocking evacuation routes, and cutting off access to food, water, and fuel, thus preventing civilians to flee, leaving them trapped in a city with dwindling supplies and under an imminent threat of a full-scale armed attack. These advances mirror the playbook used in the attack on Al Fashir, where widespread attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure followed upon the encirclement of the city, leaving aid providers unable to meet even the most acute needs and leading to mass displacement to areas even less prepared to cope with the humanitarian needs. These events must not be repeated, and we urge all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law to protect civilians. Furthermore, we request all states and others with a connection to the warring parties to exert all possible influence to avert a continuation and repetition of the atrocities committed by brokering an immediate cessation of hostilities. I thank you.
And I'll give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International for a joint statement.
Mr. President, this Council must call on the RSF and allied groups to stop their assault on El Obeid. Commanders must not issue orders violating international law, and soldiers must not implement them. This Council must also urge the United Arab Emirates to stop its military support to the RSF. This week, Amnesty International issued a report detailing the RSF's atrocities against civilians during its attack on Al Fashir in 2025. Siege and engineered starvation, abuses targeting non-Arab communities through torture, killings, rape, and detention, including women and children. These actions in the RSF playbook, repeated in Al Fashir, constitute crimes against humanity of extermination, persecution on the basis of ethnicity and gender, and amount to ethnic cleansing. To protect civilians in Sudan and prevent further abuses and crimes, all states with leverage must individually and collectively push for an immediate nationwide ceasefire, support and deploy an international protection force, expand the arms embargo on Darfur to the rest of the country, and publicly condemn actors fueling the conflict, including the UAE. All states must also enforce the embargo so weapons manufactured in China, Russia, Turkey, the UAE, Canada, and France stop appearing on the battlefield. Surge humanitarian assistance and support and protect humanitarian actors, and support all existing accountability mechanisms for Sudan, including this Council's fact-finding mission. This must include more ambitious efforts to prepare case files and, where evidence and jurisdiction exists, to prosecute all those responsible for atrocities. People in and displaced from Sudan deserve no less.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Partners for Transparency.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. ترحب مؤسسة شركاء.
Thank you, President. Our organization is pleased with the holding of this urgent debate. El Obeid has been victim of a blockade and victim of drone attacks carried out by the RSF, supported by the Emirates. On 11th June 2026, 23 people died, 19 people wounded. This is a violation of IHL. There is no more human value or legal value, it seems. That's how we've seen gathering of civilians during funerals were targeted. Residential areas were shelled, coupled with destruction of vital infrastructure. Therefore, the Kordofan cancer ward was bombed. 8 students were wounded on the 27th of June, and the goal seems to be to make life impossible in El Obeid. Silence and indifference from the international community in the face of what's taking place in El Obeid will see a repeat of the El Fashir incident. We call on the international community to intervene to prevent attacks on civilians in El Obeid. There is a need for prohibition on transfers of weapons and military equipment to the RSF. The work of this council is crucial for its credibility. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
Mr. President, we welcome the convening of this urgent debate and use of this Council's prevention mandate. We are hearing alarming reports from El Obeid, eerily reminiscent of the weeks before the RSF takeover of El Fashir. An unrelenting campaign of bombardment, including with drones, hampering free movement and hitting critical infrastructure. People are struggling to eat, drink, access electricity and other essential commodities. The RSF has a well-documented modus operandi, a track record of mass atrocities against civilians after military victories. This cannot be allowed to happen again. We need action to protect civilians, prevent atrocities, and meaningfully advance accountability. States should break their silence on growing evidence of UAE support to the RSF, directly urging them to end that support and use their leverage to prevent rather than enable further atrocities. While today we zoom in on El Obeid, we cannot forget the wider context of widespread and systematic abuses by all parties to the conflict. Continued investigations by the FFM into grave abuses by all parties remain critical, including to support future accountability efforts. We need urgent and decisive action to prevent further atrocities in line with the FFM's clear recommendations. The deployment of a protection of civilians mission, the expansion of both the arms embargo and ICC jurisdiction to the whole of Sudan, and expanded sanctions targeting all those responsible for atrocities and other serious violations in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. President. The risk to civilians in El Obeid cannot be underestimated. The time for action is now. Drone attacks on critical civilian infrastructure are worsening conditions for vulnerable civilians and hampering humanitarian operations in the city. Civilians have been targeted even while performing funeral rites for those who have been killed. There is also growing concern about hate speech on social media threatening civilian populations with death, looting and rape. Evidence of troop build-ups around the city, combined with the threats against civilians, points to imminent risk of atrocity crimes. In its February report, the UN fact-finding mission concluded that there were hallmarks of genocide in the actions of the RSF in the siege and fall of al-Fasher. We cannot stand by and watch similar atrocities unfold once again. To protect civilians in El Obeid, the SAF and RSF must adhere urgently to international humanitarian and human rights law. Those who are supporting the warring parties, including the United Arab Emirates, must stop providing resources that are fueling these atrocities. It is imperative that the arms embargo in place for Darfur is both enforced and extended to the whole of Sudan, and that there is accountability for those who have breached these mechanisms. Robust support for the UN fact-finding mission is essential, ensuring it is fully mandated and resourced to identify all actors responsible for violations. There is also an urgent need for protection force to safeguard civilians, including those displaced multiple times who are now facing these horrors once again. Thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of International Bar Association for video intervention.
The IBA's Human Rights Institute is highly concerned about the serious risk of genocide in El Obeid nor Kordofan following the massacres in Darfur. Some 500,000 people are at risk of large-scale grave violations. If we are to learn anything from the atrocities in al-Fasher, it is not to ignore the warnings and red flags that are flashing before our eyes. The duty to prevent genocide, as explained by the ICJ in its 2007 judgment, is to be triggered at the instant a state learns, or should normally have learned, of the serious risk of genocide. From that moment onwards, states are to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide so far as possible. The serious risk of genocide in Sudan has existed since 2023 at least, yet states have been failing to take decisive actions and so failing to prevent the genocide. The bar calls on this Council to investigate the serious risk of genocide in Sudan and identify all means reasonably available to stop the atrocities. Take all possible actions to support the implementation of all recommendations contained in the reports of the fact-finding mission and support accountability efforts to bring perpetrators to justice, including a UN Security Council referral of the situation in all of Sudan to the ICC. I thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you. We are gravely concerned by the escalating violence and warnings that civilians, including large numbers of internally displaced persons, face the risk of large-scale atrocities amid intensifying hostilities. The situations around Obeid demands urgent international attention and action. Preventive action must not come after another catastrophe has already unfolded. EFOD, together with Geneva International Center for Justice, call on all parties to the conflict to immediately protect civilians, cease attacks against civilian populations, and fully comply with the obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. We further call for an immediate de-escalation of hostilities in and around El Obeid. 2, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to affected populations. 3, accountability for all violations and abuses, including through strengthened international monitoring and documentation efforts. Lastly but not least, we call on renewed diplomatic engagement aimed at protecting civilians and advancing a sustainable protection solution. The people of Sudan deserve protection, dignity, justice, and peace. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies for a video intervention.
السيد الرئيس يعيش في
Mr. Chair, El Obeid shelters more than 500,000 people in addition to 100,000 displaced persons. Recent estimates suggest that the number may be higher. The people of El Obeid live under a situation similar to a siege in addition to attacks by drones and targeting fuel depots, fuel stations, hospitals, and others. We hold the RSF and its regional backers directly responsible for these attacks and for any further violations arising from a siege or attack on the city. We remind the Sudanese armed forces of their obligations to refrain from operating out of residential areas, airstrikes on populated neighborhoods, and from using alleged RSF collaboration as a pretext for arbitrary detention. All parties must comply with the Geneva Conventions and additional protocol, as well as respect their commitments in Jeddah Declaration. We call for the need to hold accountable all the external factors and to fulfill the mandate of the FFM. We call for safe humanitarian corridors and to stop the flow of arms. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
FIDH and its Sudanese member organizations, SHRM and ACJPS, welcome the holding of this urgent debate on the situation in El Obeid, as multiple sources warn of an imminent attack by the rapid support forces holding the city under siege. This council, convened in response to the genocide and mass atrocities committed by the RSF at El Fasher just over 6 months ago. We must ensure that this is not now repeated in El Obeid or elsewhere. We therefore call on the Council and Member States to urgently take all measures at their disposal, beyond mere statements of concern, to prevent such atrocities and break the endless cycle of violence in Sudan. Such actions include publicly condemning the role of allied states and external actors fueling both sides of the conflict, including the UAE, among others. As a concrete step, the Security Council arms embargo must also be extended to cover the whole of Sudan. Accountability is in itself a preventative measure. The UN Fact-Finding Mission and OACHR, in coordination with civil society and other regional initiatives on Sudan, should be supported and resourced to document and investigate the situation in El Obeid. Preservation of evidence is key so as to facilitate future accountability processes. As repeatedly called for by Sudanese civil society, the UN Security Council must expand the scope of the ICC investigation beyond Darfur to investigate atrocity crimes across all of Sudan, including El Obeid. Third states should also be prepared to receive cases on the basis of universal jurisdiction. Such accountability measures, as well as all other efforts towards peace, prevention, and protection, must be done with the meaningful participation of Sudanese civil society. Failing to act now risks further abandoning millions of Sudanese civilians. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Service for Human Rights.
أنا نونكشكوش أعمل بالمنظمة الدولية للإصلاح الجنائي ومرصد الجزيرة لحقوق الإنسان.
هذا البيان مشترك نرحب بانعقاد الجلسة العاجلة.
I work for ISHR and Al Jazeera Observatory for Human Rights. We call on the Council to step up efforts to protect civilians, ensure access of humanitarian aid, monitor and document violations in order to ensure prevention and accountability, as well as pressuring the warring parties to respect IHL and international human rights law. The city of Al Obeid is witnessing dangerous escalation in military operations. More than 50 people were killed, including women and children. Residential neighborhoods and civilian infrastructure were targeted. Sharp deterioration in essential services, which exacerbated the suffering of around 2 million people, half of them IDPs. We would like to highlight also the issue of drone strikes. We call upon this council to take additional measures in order to ensure accountability in Sudan, including by explicitly condemning external actors supporting the warring parties and calling on the Security Council to expand its arms embargo. We call upon all warring parties to resort to IHL and to immediately cease fire and to stop targeting civilian infrastructure, including women and children, and to achieve a humanitarian truce so that humanitarian assistance is done in a safe and unhindered manner. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of World Organization Against Torture.
Monsieur le Président, le MCT a fait son...
President, there's an imminent risk of a catastrophe in North Kordofan. This isn't a theoretic risk, but a reality in Al-Fasher. Collapse, protection of civilians were followed by atrocities that the independent fact-finding mission estimated presenting risk of genocide. The same dynamic is taking place in El Obeid: siege, use of drones, shelling, destruction of infrastructure, imminent land defense. 500,000 people and IDPs in the country are in danger. Attacks against supply infrastructure on water, fuel, healthcare facilities and residential areas aren't just collateral damage. They're likely to constitute grave violations of IHL and international crimes. The Human Rights Council cannot wait for a new tragedy to be documented once again. We call on the Council to call on the FFM to carry out an urgent investigation, ensure that perpetrators, including commanders, foreign actors, and the weapons suppliers are identified and held accountable. We also call for all member states with influence to go beyond mere statements by imposing targeted sanctions, supporting binding action of the Security Council. Evidence exists that the alert signs are unmistakable, and what we need today is preventive action. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Mat for Peace, Development and Human Rights Association.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is said that history repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as farce. Therefore, if we do not study what happened yesterday in El-Fasher, Junaina, and other Sudanese cities under the control of RSF militias, we will not learn anything for tomorrow. The fate of El Obeid will be the same as other cities. 500,000 civilians live in Al Obeid. They are under the threat of murder, violence, displacement, and food insecurity. Why? As a result of the RSF militias' actions. They were created by the previous political Islam and supported today by the UAE. If the RSF take hold of the city, the crimes and violations will be much more. And we have seen what happened in El-Fasher. We therefore call to put pressure to bear on RSF militias and the state sponsoring it to stop the military build-up. All states are called upon to put pressure in order to achieve a ceasefire in the Sudan and to go back to the Jeddah Declaration as an acceptable formula and a basis for future negotiation of a ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Plan International, Inc.
Plan International welcomes the convening of this urgent debate. We are deeply alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in and around Al Obeid, where more than 500,000 civilians, including over 100,000 IDPs, face an imminent threat of large-scale hostilities. The warning signs are unmistakable. The international community cannot allow Al Obeid to become another El Fasher. Children will bear the heaviest burden of any escalation, where girls face some of its most devastating and lasting consequences. As fighting approaches densely populated neighborhoods and displacement sites, girls face heightened risk of conflict-related sexual violence, forced and early marriage, trafficking, exploitation, and the loss of education and essential services. We therefore call on all parties of the conflict to exercise maximum restraint and act now to prevent a repeat of the atrocities witnessed in El Fasher by protecting civilians, especially girls and women, in accordance with international humanitarian law. Adopt zero tolerance for conflict-related sexual violence, ensuring that rape and other forms of sexual and physical violence are never used as weapons of war, and that all parties take effective measures to prevent and redress such crimes. Stop the traumatization of children by ending attacks on schools and populated areas, refraining from the use of explosive weapons with wide areas effects, and ending the recruitment of and use of children. Guarantee safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access and safe passage for civilians wishing to flee, particularly as the rainy season threatens to turn displacement into an even greater humanitarian catastrophe. We also ask for the protection of aid workers delivering humanitarian assistance on the ground. Protect critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, water, and electricity systems, and ensure uninterrupted access to food, nutrition, health, and protection services. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Rencontre Africaine pour la Défense des Droits de l'Homme.
Monsieur le Président.
President, our organizations thank the member states and civil society who have supported the holding of this urgent debate on Sudan to prevent a risk of genocide at El Obeid 23 years after Darfur, the military escalation marked by use of drones in Kordofan, as well as the siege of the region. Clashes between the Sudanese army and dissident factions of the RSF continue to provoke an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. All the four signs of a silent genocide are there. If we don't act now, a repeat of El Fasher could happen. Rado condemns the instrumentation of political actors of civil society and Sudanese diaspora by interventionist forces and belligerent factions. Our organizations condemn mass grave violations of human rights perpetrated by the RSF and by the Sudanese armed forces. All parties must comply by their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In conclusion, our organizations support the mediation efforts of the Quintet to reach a truce, followed by a lasting ceasefire, to establish inclusive dialogue leading to a civil transition for lasting peace. Finally, our organizations are opposed to any unilateral initiative towards the partition of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate in this meeting. And this brings us to the end of the urgent debate. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, colleagues, this brings us also to the end of our meeting. We will hold our next meeting in the afternoon at 3 p.m. to continue the interactive dialogue on the oral presentation by the High Commissioner of the findings of the OHCHR periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and on the interim report by the Secretary General on the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, to be followed by the interactive dialogue on OHCHR report on enhancing the technical assistance provided to the government of South Sudan. Now, colleagues, I'm going to, before closing the meeting, to announce that there will be a statement by one of our colleagues, so please stay for a while. And let me close this meeting. And I hereby close the 29th meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. Now, I understand that the delegation of Argentina has an announcement to make, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. And thank you very much to the Secretariat, the technicians, and the interpreters for this time. There are men whose lives leave behind a gap and whose lives leave behind responsibility. Today, we are bidding farewell to Gustavo Gallón. But in actual fact, the words of farewell are not enough to describe what we feel. Because there are people whose lives do not end when they depart from this world, they continue to live wherever they are, where they have shown dignity, given an example, and this is a way of honouring their own existence. Gustavo was an exceptional jurist, a wonderful diplomat, a tireless defender of human rights. His pathway speaks for itself, and he has occupied a place in law and in international law. But those of us who had the privilege of knowing him know that his merits are tremendous, are not enough to explain who he was. Because Gustavo had a scarce virtue. He was profoundly human. In a world where so often we raise our voice to be opposed, he raised his hand to say that he understood. At a time when differences appeared to push us further from each other, he built bridges. In an environment where it led to reflection, Gustavo always found the time to listen, to ask, to be sincerely interested in others' lives. He never sought to be at the center of the conversation, but however, when he spoke, everyone listened to him. Not because he spoke loudly, but because the moral authority doesn't need to do this. The serenity was one of his greatest strengths. He never confused firmness with harshness. He never believed that courtesy should weaken one's convictions. On the contrary, he understood that respect is the highest way of defending a principle. And perhaps this is one of the most important teachings he leaves behind. Human rights are not just treaties, resolutions, or speeches. They are first and foremost the way in which we deal with the person that we have in front of us. Gustavo was aware of this, and that is why he defended the major principles with the same nature that he did so in the little acts of kindness every day. We shared the corridors of the United Nations with him. We met in many meetings, very long working days and countless negotiations. But I suspect that with the passing of time, they won't be the memories that will remain. His serene smile will remain, his cordial greeting, the generous conversation at the end of a difficult meeting, the sincere interest shown in others. Because at the end of the day, that really is what makes a person stand out. Not their position, not their recognition, but really the kindness he was able to sow in the lives of others. That is why we feel major sadness today, because he wasn't just the ambassador of Colombia, but he was a very great friend. A friend has left whose presence has made this space more human. And those of us who will remain here will understand that perhaps with more clarity than ever, the fragility of our own lives. We spend our days drafting reports, negotiating texts, making statements, convinced that there will always be a next meeting, a next trip, a next conversation. Until one day we will discover that some conversations can no longer take place, that some hands can no longer be extended. And that is why we understand that the shared time together is in actual fact the greatest of privileges. In diplomacy, there is a long-standing custom. When a mission concludes, the last message of an embassy conveyed to the foreign minister has a definitive final title, end of mission. Today it is down to us to write that chapter for Gustavo. And I think perhaps the most difficult message that we could have drafted. But when we think about those words, we understand that they don't describe the full truth, because Gustavo's mission amongst us has ended, but not his mission. I would like to believe, and allow me to say with great affection, that someone has entrusted him with a new mission, that he has had a new destination, a destination where there are no borders, frontiers, there are no timetables or diplomatic beliefs, a place from which he will continue to aspire the defense of human rights, where this cause needs a clear conscience and serene courage. where a person whose dignity must be protected and where there is injustice to overcome, where there is a voice which should be raised without fear, without hatred. And that was Gustavo. We need to remember him that way. Not someone who has left, but someone who has left before his next mission. And in the meantime, here in this august assembly, we have one task before us, and that is to continue the path to ensure that his task remains intact, and to do so with the same humility, the same integrity, and the same compassion as he showed, because the greatest tribute that we can pay to him is not about beautiful words. It means that in many years' time, someone will be able to say that, mention him, and this is the real triumph. This is the most noble legacy that he could leave behind. Thank you very much indeed, dear Gustavo. Your mission amongst us has concluded. Ours, inspired on your example, has just begun. Thank you very much, sir, for this time.
Thank you, Ambassador. I myself fully share the sentiments you have conveyed, and I'm sure many, if not all, in this room also have the same sentiments as the applause had emphasized. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.